Hello and welcome. Tonight, we're going to gently drift back in time together. We're going to a world lit only by fire and the moon, a world of wood smoke, damp wool, and whispered prophecies. We'll come to appreciate a single, fateful year and understand not just the grand battles, but the quiet, fearful moments in between that made it one of the most dangerous times to be alive in English history. There is nothing for you to remember, nothing to study. Just allow my voice to be a soft companion as you prepare for a deep and peaceful rest. Before we begin our journey, if you find comfort in these stories, I would be so grateful if you'd press the like button and perhaps subscribe. It lets me know that you're here and that these quiet histories are helping you find your rest. And as always, I invite you to leave a comment, telling me where in the world you are listening from tonight. It always amazes me how many of you are listening from different parts of the world, from the quiet plains of Kansas to a coastal town in Australia or a bustling city in the UK. We are all here together, under the same moon, ready to drift into sleep. So now, find that cozy spot in your bed. Pull the blankets up and feel their gentle weight. Take a slow, deep breath in. And as you breathe out, let the day's worries melt away. Let your body grow heavy, your shoulders sink, your jaw unclench. Allow your mind to become quiet, soft, and open. Let the sounds of your room fade into a distant hum, and let my voice be your guide. You blink awake, not to the sound of an alarm, but to the distant, lonely clang of a church bell. The air is cold, and it carries the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. You're lying not on a soft mattress, but on a sack of straw, scratchy and rustling with every small movement. A coarse woolen blanket is your only shield against the chill seeping through the wattle and daub walls of your small hut. You can hear the soft lowing of an ox from the other side of a thin partition. He shares this home with you. Outside, the world is still wrapped in the gray mist of a January morning. There are no sounds of cars, no electric lights, only the crunch of frozen mud under a neighbor's boot and the faint smell of a peat fire being coaxed back to liff. You're in Anglo-Saxon England, and the year is 1066. You are a farmer, a ceorl, a free man who works the land. Your life is governed by the seasons and the church bell. But this year, a different kind of feeling hangs in the air. A feeling of uncertainty. Old King Edward, the one they call the Confessor, is dying. He has ruled for a long time, a peaceful time, but he has no son, no clear heir. And when a throne is empty, men with ambition and armies begin to look across the water. The wind feels colder this winter. The whispers in the village are quieter, more anxious. You don't know it yet, but the world is about to change. And for people like you, change is almost always dangerous. Tonight, our story unfolds in a year that would forever alter the course of history. The year 1066. It is a story not of one king, but of three, all of whom believed they had a right to the English throne. It is a story of 2 invasions, 3 bloody battles, and the end of an entire way of life. Our journey begins in the cold, final days of a long reign. King Edward the Confessor, pious and childless, lay on his deathbed in his newly built palace of Westminster. For over 2 decades, he had kept a fragile peace. But peace, like a candle flame, is easily extinguished. In this era, a king's death without a clear heir was not just a moment of sorrow. It was an open invitation to chaos. Across the English Channel, in the Duchy of Normandy, a powerful and ruthless duke named William watched and waited. He claimed Edward had once promised him the throne. Across the North Sea, in the cold lands of Norway, another formidable ruler, Harold Hardrada, the last great Viking king, also believed he had a claim forged in old pacts and a lust for conquest. And in England itself, the most powerful earl in the land, Harold Godwinson, a man of wealth, skill, and political savvy, saw his own path to the crown. This is the backdrop of our story. A kingdom holding its breath, a throne waiting for a master, and 3 ambitious men, each willing to shed blood to claim it. We will not rush through these events. We will take our time. We will feel the chill of the North Sea, hear the clang of the blacksmith's hammer preparing for war, and understand slowly why this single year was so very, very dangerous for all who lived through it. Now, let us begin. Let's drift now to the Palace of Westminster, newly built and smelling of fresh stone and beeswax. Inside, in a chamber warmed by a large hearth, a kingdom holds its breath. The year is 1066, and it is the cold, gray month of January. The wind outside carries the scent of the Thames, muddy and thick with winter rain. In this grand new palace, built to the glory of God and King, the most powerful man in England lies dying. Edward the Confessor has ruled for 24 years. He is called the Confessor not because he confesses his sins, though he does that too daily and with great devotion, but because he confesses his faith. He is a king who builds churches instead of fortresses, who spends more time on his knees in prayer than on horseback in battle. His subjects love him for his gentleness, his generosity to the poor, and his deep, unshakable piety. But now, as he lies in his great bed hung with rich tapestries, that very gentleness has become a problem. The chamber is lit by tall candles that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. You can hear the crackle of the fire, the whisper of silk robes as nobles shift nervously, and the soft murmur of prayers from the priests who keep constant vigil. The air is thick with the scent of incense and the herbs that have been burned to ward off the sickness: rosemary, thyme, and sweet lavender. But nothing can ward off what is coming. Edward's face is pale as parchment, his breathing shallow and irregular. His hands, once strong enough to hold a sword, now seem too weak to grasp the golden crucifix that lies upon his chest. Around his bed stand the most important men in England: earls and bishops, abbots and thanes. They watch every breath, listen to every word, for they know that what happens in this chamber will shape the future of their kingdom. There is Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, perhaps the most powerful man in England after the king himself. He is tall and broad-shouldered, with the bearing of a warrior, though his eyes are intelligent and calculating. He has served Edward faithfully for years, leading armies, managing the kingdom's affairs, marrying his sister to the king's brother. Harold watches the dying king with the quiet intensity of a man who knows his moment is approaching. There is Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, his weathered face grave with the knowledge of what Edward's death will mean. The church has grown powerful under Edward's gentle rule, and Stigand knows that not every man who might claim the crown will be as generous to God's servants. He mutters prayers in Latin, the ancient words of comfort in these uncertain hours. And there are others: Earl Leofric of Mercia, Earl Seward of Northumbria, men whose loyalty to the crown has kept the peace for so many years. But you don't need to remember their names. What matters is the weight of their presence, the way they fill the chamber with unspoken questions and barely contained ambition. The problem, the great, terrible problem that hangs over this deathbed like a storm cloud, is simple. Edward has no son, no direct heir, no clear successor. In over 20 years of marriage to Edith, Harold's sister, the royal couple has produced no children. Some whisper that Edward took a vow of chastity, that his marriage was one of political convenience rather than passion. Others say it was God's will, that the saintly king was too pure for earthly concerns of dynasty. But whatever the reason, the result is the same. When Edward dies, the throne of England will be empty, and an empty throne is an invitation to chaos. In this time, kingship is not simply inherited like a piece of land or a gold ring. It must be earned, claimed, defended. The king is chosen by the Witan, the council of the wisest and most powerful men in the realm. But the Witan's choice must be acceptable to the people, must be someone who can command loyalty and respect. And in this age of kings and warriors, respect often comes at the point of a sword. Edward stirs, his eyes opening slightly. The men around the bed lean closer, straining to hear. His voice, when it comes, is barely a whisper, dry as autumn leaves. He speaks of his kingdom, of his people, of his hope that England will remain at peace. But he does not speak the words they all want to hear. He does not name his successor. Perhaps he cannot choose between the competing claims. Perhaps he fears that naming one man will drive the others to war. Or perhaps, in his piety, he believes it is God's will that will decide, not his. The hours pass slowly. Outside, the pale January sun climbs weakly through the winter sky, its light filtering through the tall windows of the palace. Servants move quietly through the corridors, their voices hushed, their footsteps muffled. Word has spread beyond the palace walls, and in the streets of London, people gather in small groups, talking in low voices about what will happen when the good king dies. In the countryside, in villages and farms across England, the news travels more slowly, carried by merchants and travelers, but the concern is the same. Who will rule? Who will keep the peace? As evening approaches, Edward's breathing grows more labored. The priests increase their prayers, their voices rising and falling in the ancient rhythms of the Latin liturgy. The candles burn lower, their wax pooling on the silver holders. The great men of England keep their vigil, each lost in his own thoughts, his own plans, his own hopes and fears. And then, as the last light of the winter day fades from the windows, Edward the Confessor speaks his final words. Legend says he spoke of a vision, of England covered in flames, of God's judgment upon the land. But perhaps that is just a story told later, when men looked back and saw the catastrophe that followed. What we know for certain is that on January 5th, 1066, the pious king breathed his last, and with his death, the long, peaceful twilight of Anglo-Saxon England began to fade. The chamber falls silent except for the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind against the windows. Harold Godwinson looks around at the other faces in the room, reading the same thought in every pair of eyes. The king is dead. Long live the king. But which king? The question hangs in the air like incense smoke, heavy and ominous. As the old king's life faded, the question of who would follow him hung in the cold winter air, a silent storm waiting to break. In 3 different corners of the world, 3 men watched the English throne. They did not know each other, not really, but their destinies were about to collide like storm clouds gathering over a quiet valley. Each man believed he had the right to wear the crown of England. Each man was prepared to fight for it. And in the minds of powerful men, belief is a dangerous and compelling force. Let us drift first across the gray, windswept waters of the English Channel to the rich lands of Normandy. Here, in a stone castle that overlooks rolling fields and dark forests, lives William, Duke of Normandy. He is a man in his late 30s, stocky and strong, with the broad shoulders of a warrior and the calculating eyes of a politician. His hair is beginning to thin at the temples, and his face bears the small scars that come from a lifetime of battle. But it is not his appearance that makes men fear him. It is his reputation. William is called the Bastard, for he was born outside of marriage, the son of Duke Robert and a tanner's daughter named Herleva. In another time, in another place, such a birth might have barred him from power. But William seized his inheritance with both hands and has never let go. He has spent his entire adult life proving that, bastard-born or not, he is a true duke, a true leader, a man worthy of respect and fear. The great hall of his castle is warm with the glow of a massive fireplace. Tapestries hang from the stone walls, depicting scenes of hunting and war, and the long wooden tables are scarred from years of feasting and the occasional sword thrust during heated arguments. William sits in his high-backed chair, listening to a messenger who has just arrived from England with news of Edward's death. The messenger's clothes are still damp from the crossing, and his voice carries the weariness of a man who has ridden hard and slept little. But what is William's claim to the English throne? It rests, he says, on a promise. Years ago, when Edward was still strong and healthy, the Norman Duke visited England. According to William, and you must remember that this is his version of events, Edward promised him the succession. The childless king, so the story goes, looked upon his Norman cousin with favor and swore that when he died, William would inherit the kingdom. More than this, William claims that Harold Godwinson himself confirmed this promise. Several years ago, Harold was shipwrecked on the Norman coast while on some mission for King Edward. William rescued him, treated him as an honored guest, and in return, Harold supposedly swore an oath on holy relics that he would support William's claim to the throne. To break such an oath would be not just treachery, but sacrilege, a sin against God himself. Whether these promises were ever truly made, we cannot know for certain. The dead tell no tales, and the living often remember things as they wish them to have been. But William believes his claim is just, and that belief burns in him like a forge fire, hot and relentless. Now let us drift north across the cold, gray waters of the North Sea to the land of Norway. Here, in a hall built of massive timber logs, warmed by a fire that seems to burn as bright as the northern lights, sits a man who embodies all the fierce pride and ambition of the Viking age. His name is Harold Hardrada, and he is called the Thunderbolt of the North. Harold is a giant of a man, tall and broad, with steel-gray hair and eyes the color of winter storms. His arms are thick with muscle earned through decades of wielding sword and axe, and his hands bear the calluses of a man who has rowed countless miles across the northern seas. He wears gold rings on his fingers, the spoils of battles fought from Russia to the Mediterranean, and when he speaks, his voice carries the authority of a man who has never backed down from a fight. Harold's claim to the English throne reaches back through the tangled web of Viking politics and conquest. Years ago, there was an agreement between Magnus of Norway and Harthacnut, who was then King of England. The pact stated that if either king died without an heir, the other would inherit his kingdom. Magnus did indeed become king of Denmark and Norway when Harthacnut died, but he never had the chance to claim England before his own death. Harold, as Magnus' successor, claims that right has passed to him. It is, admittedly, a complex and somewhat distant claim. But Harold Hardrada is not a man who lets legal niceties stand in the way of his ambitions. He has spent his life taking what he wanted, from the treasures of Constantinople to the frozen plains of Russia. England, rich and peaceful after years of Edward's gentle rule, looks like a prize worthy of his attention. In his great hall, surrounded by his warriors and jarls, Harold listens to his own messengers speak of events in England. The Vikings around him are eager for adventure, for the chance to win gold and glory in the traditional way of their people. They have grown restless during the long years of peace, and the prospect of conquest stirs their blood like strong ale. But Harold is not simply a brutal raider. He is a king, a politician, and he knows he will need allies if he is to succeed in England. Fortunately, he has found one in an unexpected place, among Harold Godwinson's own family. Tostig, Harold's brother, has been Earl of Northumbria, but his harsh rule has made him deeply unpopular. Just months before Edward's death, the Northumbrians rebelled against Tostig and drove him into exile. Harold, choosing political wisdom over family loyalty, did not support his brother's cause. Now Tostig burns with resentment and the desire for revenge. He has made his way to Harold's court, and together they have forged an alliance. Tostig knows England's weaknesses, its politics, its defenses. Harold has the ships and warriors to exploit them. It is a partnership born of mutual ambition and shared grievance. Finally, let us return to England itself, to the great hall where Harold Godwinson sits in the hours after Edward's death. Harold is perhaps 40 years old, a man in the prime of his life and abilities. He is tall and strong, with intelligent brown eyes and the steady bearing of a man accustomed to command. Unlike William or Harold, Harold was born to power. His father, Godwin, was the most powerful earl in England, and Harold has inherited both his father's lands and his political acumen. Harold's claim to the throne is the most immediate and practical of the three. He is Edward's brother-in-law, married to the king's sister. More importantly, he has been Edward's right hand for years, managing the kingdom's affairs, leading its armies, negotiating with its neighbors. He knows England's people, its customs, its needs. He has the support of the most powerful earls, and he is here in England, while his rivals are across the water. The great hall where Harold holds court is built in the Old English style, with massive oak beams and walls lined with shields and spears. The fire burns in a central hearth, its smoke rising to escape through holes in the roof. Harold sits not on a throne. There is no throne yet, for he is not yet crowned, but on a carved wooden chair that has served his family for generations. Around him gather the ealdormen and thanes who have served Edward faithfully, and who now must decide where their loyalty lies. Harold's supporters argue that he is the natural choice, the obvious choice. He has proven himself in war and in peace. He understands England in a way that no foreign prince ever could. He has the backing of the church, the approval of the most powerful nobles, and the support of the common people who have seen him govern justly and well. But Harold also knows that his claim is not without its problems. He is not of royal blood. The House of Wessex has ruled England for generations, but Harold is from a different family entirely. His rise to power has been meteoric, and such rises often create enemies. There are those who whisper that he is too ambitious, too quick to seize what others might claim is not rightfully his. And then there are those oaths that William speaks of, those promises supposedly made on holy relics. Harold remembers his time in Normandy differently than William does, but he knows that his version of events may not matter if men choose to believe the Norman Duke's story instead. Each man believed he was right, and in the minds of powerful men, belief is a dangerous and powerful weapon. The news of Edward's death traveled quickly, but Harold Godwinson moved faster. There was no time for lengthy mourning, for power, like a nervous horse, will not stand still for long. In the gray dawn hours of January 6, 1066, just one day after the Confessor breathed his last, the most remarkable political maneuver in English history was already in motion. Harold understood what his distant rivals did not, that in politics, as in war, timing is everything. While William sat in his Norman castle and Harold planned in his Norwegian hall, Harold was here in England, surrounded by the very men who would decide the kingdom's fate. The Witan, that ancient council of earls and bishops, abbots and thanes, had to choose a king, and Harold intended to be that choice. The great hall at Westminster still smelled of the incense from Edward's deathbed. The January morning was cold and gray, with frost covering the bare branches of the trees that lined the Thames. Inside the hall, tall candles flickered in their iron holders, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The fire in the great hearth crackled and hissed, sending sparks up into the smoky air. But the warmth could not dispel the chill of uncertainty that filled the room. Around the long oak tables sat the most powerful men in England. There was Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, his weathered face grave beneath his ceremonial mitre. You don't need to remember all their names: Earl Leofric of Mercia, Earl Edwin, Earl Morcar. But feel their presence, the weight of their collective authority, the way their voices echoed in the vast stone chamber when they spoke. These were men who had served Edward faithfully, who had kept the peace for 2 decades, and who now faced the most important decision of their lives. Harold sat among them, but he did not dominate the discussion. He was too clever for that. Instead, he listened, he nodded thoughtfully, he asked careful questions. He let others speak first, let them voice their concerns and their fears. What would happen if they chose the wrong man? What if their choice led to civil war? What if the kingdom fell apart as it had in the dark years before Edward's reign? The debate went on for hours, but it was not really a debate at all. It was a careful dance, a ritual of consultation that would give legitimacy to a decision that had already been made in all but name. One by one, the great men of England stood to speak, and one by one, they came to the same conclusion. Harold Godwinson was the right choice, the only choice, the man who could keep England stable and secure. His qualifications were impressive and undeniable. He was Edward's brother-in-law, bound to the royal house by marriage. He had proven himself as a military commander, leading English armies against the Welsh and the Scots with skill and success. He had governed wisely as Earl of Wessex, showing himself to be fair in his judgments and generous to the church. He understood England's laws, its customs, its needs in a way that no foreign prince ever could. More than this, Harold had something that his rivals lacked. He was here, present, ready to take up the burden of kingship immediately. There would be no dangerous interregnum, no period of weakness when England would be vulnerable to its enemies. The transition would be swift and smooth, like a torch passed from hand to hand without the flame ever flickering. But perhaps most importantly, Harold had the support of the men who mattered. The earls trusted him because he was one of them, raised in their world, understanding their concerns. The bishops favored him because he had always been generous to the church and respectful of its authority. The thanes and lesser nobles knew him as a man who honored his obligations and rewarded loyalty. When the formal vote was taken, it was unanimous. Harold Godwinson would be King of England. The ancient words were spoken, the traditional ceremonies observed. But even as the decision was made, everyone in that smoky, candlelit hall knew that this was only the beginning. Choosing a king was one thing. Making that choice stick was another matter entirely. Harold himself understood this better than anyone. As the great men of England knelt before him and spoke the words of allegiance, he was already thinking ahead, already planning for the challenges that would come. He knew that across the Channel, William would rage when he heard the news. He knew that across the North Sea, Harold Hardrada would see opportunity in England's change of leadership. The new king would have to move quickly to secure his position. The coronation was set for the very next day, January 7th. There was no time for elaborate preparations, no opportunity for the kind of grand ceremony that would normally mark such a momentous occasion. But sometimes necessity creates its own kind of grandeur. In the great abbey that Edward had built at Westminster, a ceremony took place that was both simple and profoundly moving. Westminster Abbey was Edward's greatest earthly achievement, a massive stone church built in the new Norman style, with soaring arches and vast windows that filled the interior with pale winter light. The air was thick with incense, and the sound of Gregorian chant echoed off the stone walls like the voices of angels. The abbey was packed with nobles and clerics, but also with ordinary Londoners who had come to witness this historic moment. Harold walked slowly down the long nave, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. He wore a simple tunic of fine wool, dyed the deep blue of royalty, and over his shoulders lay a cloak trimmed with ermine. But he carried himself like a king even before the crown touched his head. Straight-backed, dignified, his eyes focused ahead on the altar where his destiny waited. The ceremony itself followed ancient traditions that reached back centuries into the mist of English history. Harold knelt before the altar while Archbishop Stigand intoned the sacred words in Latin. Holy oil was poured over the new king's head in the ritual of anointing, marking him as God's chosen representative on earth. The oil was cold against his skin, and its scent, a mixture of balsam and precious spices, would remain with him for days afterward. Then came the moment that transformed an earl into a king. The crown of England was placed upon Harold's head. It was not an elaborate thing by later standards, a simple circlet of gold set with garnets and pearls, but it carried the weight of centuries. This was the crown that had belonged to the House of Wessex, the crown that Alfred the Great might have worn, the crown that made its wearer the most powerful man in one of Europe's richest kingdoms. The scepter was placed in Harold's right hand, a rod of gold topped with a cross, symbol of his authority over both temporal and spiritual matters. In his left hand, he received the orb, representing his dominion over the earth. These were not mere symbols, but sacred objects, blessed by generations of archbishops, touched by the hands of kings both great and forgotten. When Harold rose from his knees, he was no longer Earl of Wessex. He was Harold too, by the grace of God, King of England, defender of the faith, Lord of all the English. The great men in the abbey knelt before him and spoke the words of homage, their voices echoing in the vast stone space. We acknowledge you as our sovereign Lord, and promise to bear you faith and truth of life and limb, so help us God. But even as the ceremony reached its climax, even as the abbey rang with shouts of "Long live the King," Harold knew that his real test was yet to come. A coronation could make a man king in name, but only success in the trials ahead would make him king in truth. Outside the abbey, bells rang across London, their bronze voices carrying the news through the narrow streets and across the grey Thames. In the markets and alehouses, in the workshops and manor houses, people spoke in hushed, excited tones about their new king. Some were hopeful. Harold was known to be a just man, a capable leader. Others were worried. Change always brought uncertainty, and uncertainty was dangerous for common folk who had little control over their own fate. In the royal palace, Harold held his first council as king. The same men who had chosen him now gathered to advise him, but the dynamics had changed subtly. He was no longer their equal, but their sovereign, no longer asking for their support, but commanding their service. The weight of the crown was not just metaphorical. The gold circlet was heavier than it looked, and Harold could feel it pressing against his temples as he discussed the urgent business of securing his kingdom. Messages had to be sent to every corner of England, announcing the new king's accession and demanding the loyalty of every earl, every sheriff, every reeve. The royal treasury had to be secured, the army readied, the defenses of the realm prepared. And always, in the back of everyone's mind, was the knowledge that somewhere across the water, other men were making their own plans. The crown now sat upon his head. But it was a heavy crown, and its shine was already attracting envious eyes from across the sea. As the nights of April grew warmer, a new star appeared in the sky. It was not a gentle star, but a furious one with a long, shimmering tail that stretched across the heavens like a ghostly finger pointing toward some terrible destiny. Night after night, it blazed in the darkness, growing brighter and more terrible, until even the bravest men looked up and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the spring air. We know now that this celestial visitor was Halley's Comet, making one of its regular journeys through our solar system, as predictable as the seasons and as natural as sunrise. But to the people of 1066, it was something far more ominous. It was a sign, a warning, a message written in fire across the vault of heaven. And the message it seemed to carry was simple and terrifying. Change was coming, and that change would be written in blood. Let us drift now to a small village somewhere in the English countryside, perhaps in Kent or Sussex, where the fields are beginning to show the first green shoots of spring barley. The village is no different from 1,000 others scattered across the kingdom. A cluster of wooden houses with thatched roofs, a small stone church with a square tower, fields stretching away toward distant woods. At night, when the work is done and the animals are settled, the villagers gather in the common area between the houses, their faces lit by the glow of a small fire built from dead wood and dried dung. They have come, as people have always come, to share the day's news, to tell stories, to find comfort in each other's company as darkness falls. But tonight, like every night for the past week, their eyes are drawn upward, toward the strange new star that dominates the northern sky. It hangs there like a sword of light, its tail streaming behind it, and even the oldest among them, men and women who have lived through famines and wars and plagues, cannot remember seeing anything like it. "It bodes ill," whispers an old woman, her gnarled hands clutching a wooden cross that hangs from her neck. "My grandmother told me of such a star that appeared when the old king died, and war followed after." The others nod solemnly. In their world, Everything has meaning. Every unusual event is a message from God, or the saints, or perhaps darker powers. The natural and supernatural are not separate realms, but part of one great tapestry, woven by divine hands according to purposes that mortal minds can barely comprehend. A younger man, a farmer with calloused hands and earth under his fingernails, points at the comet's tail. "See how it points toward London," he says. "Toward the new king. Perhaps it warns of danger to his reign." The others murmur agreement. They are simple people, these villagers, but they are not stupid. They understand that the fate of kings affects the fate of common folk. When kingdoms fall, it is the poor who suffer most, their crops burned, their sons pressed into service, their daughters at the mercy of passing armies. In the great cities, learned men try to offer more sophisticated explanations. In the monasteries, monks consult their ancient texts, looking for precedents and interpretations. Some suggest that the comet heralds the second coming of Christ, the end of the world foretold in the book of Revelation. Others argue that it merely signifies change, transformation, the end of one age and the beginning of another. But even the most educated clerics cannot entirely suppress the chill that runs down their spines when they gaze upon that fearsome star. In London, in the Palace of Westminster where Harold holds court, the king's advisors debate the comet's meaning with the careful language of diplomacy. They do not want to alarm their sovereign, but neither can they ignore what the whole kingdom can see with their own eyes. The court astronomers, such as they are in this age, speak learnedly of the movements of celestial bodies, of the music of the spheres, of the ancient wisdom of the Greeks and Romans. But their words carry little conviction, and Harold can see the fear in their eyes. Harold himself looks upon the comet with the practical mind of a politician and soldier. He knows that what matters is not what the star actually signifies, if anything, but what people believe it signifies. And across his kingdom, from the humblest serf to the proudest earl, people are looking up at the night sky and seeing doom written in letters of fire. Such beliefs have a way of fulfilling themselves, and Harold knows that his enemies will not be slow to exploit the fear and uncertainty that the comet has brought. Night after night, the king climbs to the highest tower of his palace, often alone, sometimes accompanied by a trusted advisor or a faithful priest. From here, he can see across the rooftops of London, across the dark ribbon of the Thames, toward the channel where his enemies wait. And there, hanging in the sky like a celestial sword, is the comet, brighter than Venus, more terrible than any star in the memory of living men. "My lord," says one of his counselors, an elderly man who has served 3 kings and seen the rise and fall of many great houses, "the people are growing restless. They see the star and whisper of God's judgment. Perhaps we should proclaim a day of fasting and prayer, to turn aside whatever wrath this portent warns of." Harold considers this advice carefully. He is a pious man, as most men of his time are pious, but he is also a realist. Public displays of religious devotion might calm some fears, but they might also give credence to the idea that there is indeed something to fear. It is a delicate balance, and one wrong move could turn anxiety into panic. In the countryside, the comet's nightly appearance has become a ritual of dread. Families gather outside their homes as the sun sets, watching the western sky until the terrible star becomes visible. Children cling to their mother's skirts, and even the boldest young men speak in hushed tones. The priests do their best to offer comfort, reminding their flocks that God's will is always just, even when it is beyond human understanding. But privately, many of these same priests spend long hours on their knees, praying for guidance and protection. The comet appears not just to the English, of course. Across the Channel, in the courts and castles of Normandy, William's followers also gaze up at the night sky and wonder what message it carries. But here, the interpretation is subtly different. To the Normans, the comet seems to point not toward disaster, but toward opportunity. If it signifies change, then perhaps that change will favor their cause. If it warns of the fall of kings, then perhaps it heralds the fall of the usurper Harold and the rise of their rightful duke. William himself is too shrewd to put much stock in celestial omens, but he is also too clever to ignore their power over other men's minds. If his enemies see doom in the sky, then the comet serves his purposes as well as any army. Fear, he knows, is a weapon more powerful than any sword, and if the English are already looking to the heavens in terror, they may be less prepared to look to their earthly defenses. In the far north, in the halls of Norway, Harold Hardrada and his Viking warriors interpret the comet according to their own traditions and beliefs. To them, It recalls the stories of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when the old world would end in fire and a new world would be born from its ashes. But this does not frighten them as it frightens others. The Vikings have always believed that the end of one thing is the beginning of another, and if kingdoms are to fall and new ones rise, they intend to be among the conquerors, not the conquered. For 7 weeks the comet blazes in the night sky, growing brighter and more spectacular as April gives way to May. Its tail stretches across a quarter of the heavens, and on clear nights it casts a pale, ghostly light that makes the familiar landscape seem strange and ominous. Dogs howl more than usual, and horses shy at shadows. Even the wildlife seems affected. Birds fly in confused patterns, and cattle low restlessly in their fields. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the comet begins to fade. Night by night it grows dimmer, its tail shorter, until by the end of May it is barely visible to the naked eye. But its message, whatever that message might have been, has been delivered. The fear it brought does not fade with its light. If anything, the comet's disappearance seems to make people more nervous, not less. The show is over, they seem to think, and now the real drama is about to begin. In village churches across England, priests offer special prayers of thanksgiving for the passing of the celestial terror. But their congregations are not entirely reassured. The comet may be gone, but the questions it raised remain. What was it warning of? What change is coming? And when will that change arrive? Harold, standing once again on his tower as the last traces of the comet disappear into the darkness, knows that he will not have to wait long for his answer. The star has faded, but across the Channel and across the North Sea, his enemies are still there, still planning, still preparing. The comet may have been nothing more than a trick of celestial mechanics, but the threats it seemed to herald are all too real. The people watched the sky with fear in their hearts. The comet did not speak in words, but everyone felt its message. Change was coming. Let us drift now, across the gray, choppy waters of the Channel, to the forests and fields of Normandy. Here, a different kind of storm was brewing. The messenger arrived at Rouen on a horse whose flanks were white with foam and exhaustion. He had ridden hard from the ports, carrying news that would echo through history. In the great hall of the ducal palace, William of Normandy sat breaking his fast with his nobles, the morning light filtering through narrow windows, casting long shadows across the rushes scattered on the stone floor. You can almost hear the clatter of the wooden cup as it fell from William's hand when the words reached his ears. Harold Godwinson has been crowned King of England. The hall fell silent, save for the distant sound of a dog barking in the courtyard and the soft crackle of the fire in the great hearth. William was not a man given to outward displays of emotion, but those who knew him well could see the fury building behind his dark eyes. His jaw tightened. His knuckles whitened as his hands gripped the edge of the table. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. The nobles around him shifted uncomfortably, the scrape of their chairs against stone the only sound in the suddenly tense chamber. When William finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, but there was steel beneath the silk. "Harold," he said, and the name seemed to hang in the air like smoke, "has broken his sacred oath to me. Let us pause here, in this moment of quiet rage, and understand what William believed to be true. Years earlier, Harold Godwinson had been shipwrecked on the Norman coast. William had rescued him, treated him as an honored guest, and according to Norman accounts, Harold had sworn a solemn oath over holy relics to support William's claim to the English throne when King Edward died. Whether this oath was freely given or extracted under duress, we may never know. But to William, it was as binding as any contract written in law. The Duke rose from his chair, and you can imagine the soft rustle of his robes, the measured tread of his boots on the stone as he began to pace. His mind, sharp as any blade forged in his armories, was already working through the implications. Harold's coronation was not just a political betrayal. It was a sacrilege, an insult to God himself, for what were oaths sworn on holy relics but promises made before the Almighty? "Summon my builders," William commanded, his voice carrying across the hall. "Summon my shipwrights. Summon every man who can swing an axe or wield a hammer." The nobles exchanged glances. They had seen their duke angry before, but this was different. This was the cold, calculating fury of a man who had decided that words were no longer sufficient. Within days, the forests of Normandy rang with the sound of axes biting into wood. Ancient oaks, their trunks as wide as a man could stretch his arms, fell with great crashes that sent birds wheeling into the sky. The rhythmic thud-thud-thud of axes became the heartbeat of a duchy preparing for war. Sawyers worked from dawn to dusk, their long saws singing through timber, creating the planks that would become the backbone of an invasion fleet. You don't need to remember the exact number of ships William would eventually build. Some say 800, others claim more. What matters is the sound of it all. The ring of hammers on nails, the rasp of planes shaving wood smooth, the calls of shipwrights directing their crews. In every port along the Norman coast, the air grew thick with the scent of pitch and tar, the materials that would seal the hulls against the hungry sea. But ships alone do not make an invasion. William needed men, and not just any men. He needed warriors willing to risk everything for the promise of English land and English gold. From his own domains came his household knights, men who had sworn personal loyalty to him and would follow him to the gates of hell if he commanded. But he needed more. Messengers rode out from Rouen carrying William's summons to every corner of France. To Brittany, where landless younger sons dreamed of carving out their own estates. To Flanders, where mercenaries sold their swords to the highest bidder. To the distant lands of the Empire, where tales of English wealth had long tantalized ambitious men. The message was simple: join William's righteous cause, and be rewarded with land beyond your wildest dreams. The responses came slowly, carried by dust-covered riders who had traveled for weeks to reach Normandy. Count after count, lord after lord, sent word of their support. Some came for loyalty, others for profit, but all of them drawn by the magnetic pull of William's certainty. He did not simply believe he would win. He knew it, with the unshakable faith of a man who saw God's hand in his cause. In the armories, the work never ceased. Blacksmiths bent over their anvils, their faces lit by the orange glow of forge fires, hammering out the tools of war. Swords and spears, axes and arrowheads, the metal ringing like church bells as each piece was shaped and tempered. The air grew heavy with the smell of hot iron and coal smoke, the very atmosphere of preparation for battle. Mail shirts were crafted link by link, each ring of steel carefully fitted to its neighbor, creating flexible armor that could turn aside a sword thrust while allowing a warrior to move freely. These were works of art as much as instruments of war, for a Norman knight took pride in his equipment, knowing that his life might depend on the skill of the armorer who made it. In the great halls and manor houses, the practical work of logistics unfolded. Scribes bent over their parchments, making lists of supplies that would be needed for the crossing and the campaign beyond. Barrels of salted pork and hardtack biscuits, skins of wine and water, fodder for the war horses that would carry the Norman knights into battle. Every detail had to be considered, for an army without supplies was no army at all. And what of the horses? The horses were perhaps the most precious cargo of all. These were not the sturdy farm animals that pulled Norman plows, but destriers, the great war horses trained to carry an armored knight into the thick of battle. Each one was worth more than a peasant might earn in a lifetime, and transporting them across the channel would be a challenge that tested the skills of the finest shipbuilders. Special vessels had to be constructed, wider and more stable than ordinary ships, with ramps that could be lowered to allow the horses to board and disembark. You can imagine the scene at the ports. These magnificent animals, their coats gleaming, their eyes rolling with nervousness as they were led up the swaying gangplanks. The sound of their hooves on wood, the soft nickering of their calls, the patient voices of their handlers trying to calm them for the journey ahead. As summer deepened into autumn, the great camp at St. Valery-sur-Somme became a city of canvas and rope. Thousands of men from across France and beyond gathered under William's banner, their tents stretching along the coast like a vast, colorful meadow. The air was filled with a dozen different languages and dialects, but all united in a single purpose. Here, a group of Breton knights practiced their sword work, their blades flashing in the afternoon sun. There, a company of Flemish crossbowmen tested their weapons, the sharp crack of their strings echoing across the camp. Everywhere, the endless work of preparation continued. Sharpening weapons, mending armor, checking and rechecking the 1,000 details that would spell the difference between victory and disaster. William himself moved through the camp like a force of nature, inspecting, questioning, commanding. His presence was felt everywhere, a reminder that this was not merely an adventure, but a crusade, a righteous war to reclaim what was his by right. When he spoke to his men, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. God was on their side. Harold was a perjurer and a usurper. Victory was not just possible, but inevitable. But as the weeks passed, nature herself seemed to conspire against the Norman cause. The winds that should have carried the fleet across the channel blew stubbornly from the north and west, penning the ships in their harbors. Day after day, William stood on the shore, his cloak whipping in the contrary breeze, watching the waves that seemed to mock his ambitions. Still, he did not despair. If anything, the delay only sharpened his resolve. Every day of waiting was another day to perfect his preparations, to drill his men, to ensure that when the moment came, his great machine of war would function with deadly precision. All through the spring and summer, Normandy was a hive of activity. A great war machine was being built, piece by patient piece, all of it aimed at one man, King Harold. Elsewhere, in the cold, clear fjords of Norway, another fleet was gathering. These were not the flat-bottomed transports of the Normans, but the sleek, fearsome longships of the Vikings. Let us drift now across the North Sea, carried on the salt-scented wind to a land of mountains and mist, where the water runs deep and black between towering cliffs. Here, in the royal hall at Trondheim, another king brooded over another claim to the English throne. But this was a different kind of king entirely. Harold Hardrada, his very name means hard ruler, was a giant of a man, standing nearly 7 feet tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5. His beard was the color of winter frost, his eyes pale as Arctic ice, and his reputation for ruthless warfare had earned him the sobriquet Thunderbolt of the North. At 51 years old, he was already a legend, a man who had fought from the frozen shores of Greenland to the sun-baked walls of Constantinople. The great hall where he held court was a monument to a warrior's life. Shields lined the walls, not decorative pieces, but battle-scarred veterans of a dozen campaigns. Swords hung from the rafters, their blades reflecting the firelight from the central hearth. The very air seemed to thrum with stories of conquest and glory, told and retold by the skalds who sang of their king's mighty deeds. On this particular evening, as snow began to dust the mountains outside, Harold sat in his high seat, carved from the trunk of an ancient oak and inlaid with silver and walrus ivory. Before him stood a man who would change the course of English history. Tostig Godwinson, brother to the newly crowned King Harold, and a man consumed by bitter resentment. Tostig had once been Earl of Northumbria, the most powerful nobleman in northern England after his own brother. But his harsh rule had sparked rebellion among his subjects, and when they rose against him, King Edward had been forced to send him into exile rather than risk civil war. Now Tostig wandered the courts of Europe, a man without a kingdom, burning with the desire for revenge against the brother who had, in his mind, betrayed him. Listen to the soft crackle of the fire as these two men, the exiled earl and the Viking king, spoke in low voices about ambition and opportunity. The hall grew quiet around them, save for the distant howl of wind through the mountain passes. Even the king's hounds, great shaggy beasts that normally padded restlessly around the hall, seemed to sense the importance of this conversation and lay still beside the hearth. Tostig's proposal was simple and deadly. Together, they would invade England from the north while William's attention was focused on the southern coasts. Harold's claim to the English throne was based on an old treaty between his predecessor, Magnus of Norway, and Harthacnut, who had once ruled both Denmark and England. When Harthacnut died without an heir, Magnus had claimed both kingdoms, though he had never had the strength to enforce his claim to England. Now, 3 generations later, Harold saw his chance to succeed where Magnus had failed. But this was not merely about ancient treaties and legal claims. For Harold Hardrada, the prospect of conquering England represented something far more precious than gold or land. It offered the chance for immortal glory, the kind of fame that would live forever in the songs of the skalds. He was already the most successful Viking king of his generation, but England would be his masterpiece. You can almost hear the scrape of his chair against the wooden floor as Harold rose to pace before the fire, his shadow dancing on the walls like some ancient god of war. His mind was already working through the logistics of invasion, the countless details that would determine success or failure. Unlike William's methodical preparations in Normandy, Harold's planning had the swift, predatory efficiency of a wolf pack selecting its prey. Word went out through the fjords and valleys of Norway. The king was calling for warriors, and warriors answered. They came from the fishing villages that clung to the rocky coasts, men whose hands were as skilled with a battle axe as with a net. They came from the mountain farms, hard men carved from granite and ice, who knew that a summer's raiding could bring enough silver to last through the harsh northern winter. But Harold's call reached beyond Norway's borders. In Denmark, where the memory of Canut's great North Sea empire still stirred men's hearts, jarls and their followers prepared for war. From the Orkney Islands came Norsemen who had never forgotten that they were descended from the Sea Kings who had once terrorized Europe's coasts. The shipyards of Trondheim and Bergen echoed with the sound of construction. But this was a different kind of building than what was happening in Normandy. These craftsmen were not creating a new fleet. They were preparing the descendants of the vessels that had carried Vikings to Greenland and Vinland, to the gates of Paris and the markets of Constantinople. Each longship was a work of art, its hull carved from a single oak trunk, its lines as graceful as a swan and as deadly as a shark. The famous dragon heads that crowned their prows were works of intricate carving, meant to strike terror into enemies and ward off the sea spirits that might threaten the vessel's passage. You can almost smell the pine tar and oakum that sealed the hulls, the leather and wool oil that waterproofed the rigging. These ships were built for speed and stealth, not for carrying vast quantities of supplies like William's invasion barges. A Viking longship could be beached on any sandy shore, could navigate rivers that would trap heavier vessels, could appear without warning from the morning mist like a messenger of doom. They were the perfect tools for the kind of swift, savage warfare that had made the Vikings the terror of medieval Europe. As spring turned to summer, the great fleet began to assemble in the sheltered waters of the Solent Fjord. One by one, the longships arrived, their crews singing the ancient rowing songs that had paced Viking expeditions for centuries. The sound echoed off the water and the surrounding cliffs, deep voices raised in harmony, the splash of oars keeping time, the creak of rigging in the coastal breeze. Harold's own flagship was the largest of them all, a magnificent vessel called Serpent's Eye, its hull painted in alternating stripes of red and black, its sail emblazoned with the raven banner that had flown over Viking victories from Ireland to Russia. When fully manned, it carried a crew of 70 warriors, each one a veteran of countless battles, each one personally loyal to the king who had led them to victory and wealth across half the known world. The provisioning of the fleet was a careful balance between necessity and practicality. These ships could not carry the vast quantities of supplies that William was loading into his transports. Instead, they carried what Vikings had always carried: weapons, basic tools, and the expectation that they would live off the land they conquered. Barrels of preserved fish and dried meat, skins of ale and fresh water, but always with the understanding that a successful Viking raid was self-sustaining. The warriors themselves were a sight to stir the blood or freeze it, depending on your perspective. Many still wore their hair long in the old style, braided with silver rings and carved bone ornaments that spoke of battles won and enemies defeated. Their weapons were heirlooms passed down through generations: pattern-welded swords with names like Leg Biter and Skull Splitter, axes whose blades had tasted blood in a dozen different lands. But perhaps most impressive of all was their absolute confidence. These were not desperate men gambling everything on a single throw of the dice. They were professionals, practitioners of the most successful military tradition in medieval Europe. For 3 centuries, Vikings had been the masters of surprise warfare, appearing suddenly from the sea to strike at targets hundreds of miles inland before vanishing back into the ocean mists. As the summer wore on, scouts brought word of events in England and Normandy. Harold Godwinson had been crowned and was strengthening his defenses. William of Normandy was building his great fleet, but seemed trapped by contrary winds. The timing, Harold realized, was perfect. While the English king watched the southern horizon for Norman sails, the Viking fleet could strike from the north like a bolt from Thor's hammer. The final preparations took on an almost ritualistic quality. Weapons were blessed by the old priests who still served the ancient gods in secret, even in this officially Christian kingdom. Runes were carved into sword hilts and spear shafts, calling on Odin the All-Father for victory and on Tyr the war god for courage in battle. On the night before departure, Harold held a great feast in his hall. The ale flowed freely, the skalds sang of ancient victories, and the king himself stood to address his warriors. His voice, deep and resonant, filled the smoky hall as he spoke of the glory that awaited them across the sea. England, he told them, was rich beyond imagining. Its monasteries stuffed with gold and silver, its towns ripe for plunder, its throne waiting for a true king to claim it. When dawn broke over the fjord, it revealed a sight that would have struck terror into the hearts of England's coastal watchers. More than 300 longships, their dragon heads gleaming in the morning light, their crews ready for war. The largest Viking fleet assembled in a generation was preparing to set sail. Their sails caught the northern wind, carrying them south towards England. The first of the 2 storms was about to make landfall. The Viking longships scraped ashore on the banks of the River Humber. The people of the north, who had long lived with the threat of raids, now faced a full army. Let us drift now to the wide, gray waters of the Humber estuary, where the rivers Ouse and Trent merge before flowing into the North Sea. It is September now, and the air carries the first crisp promise of autumn. The leaves on the willows that line the riverbanks are beginning to turn from green to gold, and morning mist rises from the water like the breath of sleeping giants. Here, in this quiet landscape of marshes and meadows, the first great drama of 1066 was about to unfold. The Viking fleet had made the crossing from Norway in just 5 days, a testament to both the skill of their navigators and the favor of the winds. Now, more than 300 longships crowded the river mouth, their dragon heads pointing inland like a forest of wooden spears aimed at the heart of England. You can imagine the sound as the ships ran aground on the muddy banks, the scrape of oak keels against gravel, the splash of warriors leaping into the shallow water, the shouts of ship captains organizing the landing. But there was method in this apparent chaos. Harold Hardrada had done this before many times, and his army moved with the practiced efficiency of professionals. The local people, farmers and fishermen who had risen that morning expecting nothing more eventful than mending nets or tending cattle, suddenly found themselves witnesses to history. From the safety of distant hills, they watched in awe and terror as the greatest Viking army in a generation established itself on English soil. Smoke began to rise from the riverbank as the Norsemen lit their cooking fires, and the sound of axes rang out as they began to construct a fortified camp. Word of the landing spread like wildfire through the countryside. Mounted messengers galloped along the old Roman roads, their horses' hooves drumming against the stone with urgent rhythm. Village priests rang their church bells in warning, the bronze notes carrying across the fields and valleys like the voice of doom itself. By evening, the news had reached York, the greatest city of the north, and by the following dawn, it was racing southward toward King Harold's court. But Harold Hardrada was not content to simply sit by the river and wait for the English to respond. This was a man who had spent his life in motion, a predator who understood that speed and momentum were often more valuable than numbers or fortifications. Within hours of landing, his advance guard was already moving inland, following the old roads toward York with the steady, ground-covering pace of veteran campaigners. The responsibility for defending the north fell to 2 young earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria. These were not seasoned warriors like their Viking opponents, but rather political appointees who had inherited their positions through marriage alliances and court favor. Edwin was barely 25, Morcar perhaps a year older, and neither had ever faced anything more challenging than putting down local rebellions or settling disputes between neighboring lords. Yet to their credit, they did not hesitate. When word reached them of the Viking landing, both earls immediately began gathering their forces. The great war horns sounded from the towers of York, their deep notes echoing across the surrounding countryside. From manor houses and village halls, the FYRD, the citizen soldiers of Anglo-Saxon England, began to assemble. These were not professional warriors like Harold's Vikings, but they were far from helpless. The FYRD had defended England for generations, and every free man knew his duty when the horns sounded. They came with whatever weapons they could find, some with proper swords and mail shirts inherited from fathers or grandfathers, others with nothing more than a spear, a shield, and the clothes on their backs. You can picture them gathering in the pre-dawn darkness outside York's walls. Farmers still smelling of the harvest, craftsmen with work-calloused hands, young men who had never been farther from home than the nearest market town. The sound of their voices, nervous jokes, quiet prayers, the rustle of leather and the clink of metal, all mixing together in the cool morning air. The Earl's plan was simple and, in its way, brave. Rather than wait behind York's walls for a siege, they would march out to meet the Vikings in open battle. It was a gamble born of necessity. Harold's army was living off the land, and every day they remained in English territory, more farms would be burned, more villages plundered. Better to fight now, while the English army was fresh, and the Vikings were still organizing themselves after their landing. The chosen battlefield was a place called Fulford Gate, about 2 miles south of York. Here, the old road crossed a small stream called Germany Beck, and the ground on either side was broken by patches of marsh and bog. It was not ideal terrain for a battle, but it had one crucial advantage. It would prevent the Vikings from using their superior numbers to outflank the English line. On the morning of September 20th, 1066, the two armies faced each other across the marshy ground. The English had perhaps 3,000 men, formed up in the traditional Saxon shield wall, a solid line of overlapping shields with spear points bristling between them like the quills of some great hedgehog. Behind the shields stood the best-armed warriors, their swords ready to strike at any enemy who broke through the line. Across the field, the Viking army was arranged in a different formation entirely. Harold had perhaps twice as many men, and he deployed them in the classic Norse wedge formation, a great triangle of warriors with the most experienced fighters at the point, designed to punch through enemy lines like a spear through cloth. At the very tip of the wedge stood Harold himself, his great two-handed sword gleaming in the morning light, his raven banner snapping in the wind above his head. For a moment, the two armies simply stared at each other across the narrow stream. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through the marsh grass, the nervous snorting of horses, and the distant cry of a curlew somewhere in the reeds. Both sides knew that in the next few minutes, many of the men standing in those neat lines would be dead. The battle began, as medieval battles often did, with a flight of arrows. The English had few archers, but the Vikings had many, and their shafts rose into the gray sky like a flock of deadly birds before falling among the Saxon shields. You can almost hear the sharp crack as arrow points struck wood and metal, the cries of wounded men, the shouted orders of officers trying to keep their lines steady. But the real fighting began when Harold gave the order to advance. The great Viking wedge moved forward like a living thing, thousands of feet tramping in rough unison, the warriors chanting their ancient battle songs. The sound grew louder as they approached the English line, a deep, rhythmic roar that seemed to make the very ground tremble. The impact, when it came, was like thunder. Shield crashed against shield, spear points sought gaps in armor, and the careful formations of both armies dissolved into a swirling melee of individual combats. The marshy ground, already soft from recent rains, quickly became a churned morass of mud and blood. For a time, the English line held. The FYRD, whatever their lack of experience, were fighting for their homes and families, and desperation can make heroes of ordinary men. Earl Edwin fought like a man possessed, his sword rising and falling in great arcs, while Morcar rallied his men with shouts of encouragement that could be heard even over the din of battle. But slowly, inevitably, the superior experience and numbers of the Vikings began to tell. The great wedge formation, even though it had lost its perfect shape in the melee, continued to push forward. English warriors, exhausted by the effort of holding their heavy shields steady against repeated attacks, began to give ground. What had started as an orderly withdrawal quickly became something more dangerous. The breakthrough, when it came, was sudden and catastrophic. A group of Viking berserkers, warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, believing themselves to be possessed by the spirits of wolves and bears, managed to punch a hole in the English center. Once the shield wall was broken, it could not be reformed, and the careful discipline of the FYRD began to collapse. What followed was not so much a battle as a rout. The English, their formation shattered, began to flee toward York. But retreat across marshy ground is a slow and dangerous business, and the Vikings pursued them with the relentless efficiency of wolves hunting deer. Many of the fleeing English were cut down before they could reach safety, their bodies left scattered across the boggy fields. Earl Edwin managed to escape, wounded but alive, leading the remnants of his force back to York's walls. Earl Morcar was less fortunate. He was captured during the retreat, though he would live to see another day. Of the 3,000 men who had marched out from York that morning, perhaps half would never return. As the sun began to set over the battlefield, the Vikings moved among the dead, gathering weapons and armor, caring for their own wounded, and counting the cost of their victory. They had won decisively, but it had not been without price. Several hundred of Harold's warriors lay still among the marsh grass, and many more bore wounds that would slow their march. The city of York, its walls crowded with refugees and the families of the slain, faced a terrible choice. They could endure a siege, hoping that King Harold would arrive in time to relieve them, or they could surrender and hope for mercy from the conquerors. After a brief council, the city fathers chose surrender. The gates opened, and Harold Hardrada entered York in triumph. The city of York surrendered, and for a moment, it seemed the Viking king would claim the north. But news of the defeat was already traveling south on tired horses. In his camp on the southern coast, King Harold received the news he had dreaded. He had been looking south, but the danger had come from the north. And so began one of the most remarkable marches in English history. Picture, if you will, the royal pavilion pitched on the chalk cliffs above the English Channel. The canvas walls rippled gently in the sea breeze, and through the open flap, you could see the endless expanse of gray water stretching toward the Norman coast. King Harold had been here for weeks, his army spread along the coastline, watching and waiting for the sails that would herald William's invasion. The messenger who brought word of Fulford Gate arrived on a horse whose sides heaved like bellows, foam still clinging to the bit. He had ridden for 3 days and nights, changing mounts at royal way stations, carrying news that would test a king's resolve like nothing had before. Inside the pavilion, Harold was studying maps by candlelight, tracing the likely routes a Norman army might take inland, when the exhausted rider was ushered into his presence. You can almost hear the rustle of parchment as Harold set aside his charts, the soft thud of his boots on the carpeted floor as he rose to receive the message. The words, when they came, fell like hammer blows. The Vikings have landed. Earl Edwin defeated. York has surrendered. Harold Hardrada calls himself King of England. For a long moment, Harold said nothing. Outside, the evening watch was being set, and you could hear the measured tread of sentries, the distant call of gulls wheeling over the waves. The candle flames flickered in their holders, casting dancing shadows on the tent walls, as the King of England absorbed the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen his realm. This was the nightmare scenario that had haunted Harold's thoughts since his coronation. Not one invasion, but two, and now, while he guarded against William in the south, Harold Hardrada had struck from the north like lightning from a clear sky. Worse still, the Norwegian king had allied himself with Tostig, Harold's own brother, turning family loyalty into the sharpest of weapons. But Harold Godwinson had not become the most powerful earl in England, had not survived the deadly politics of Edward's court, had not won a crown by yielding to despair. Within minutes of receiving the news, his mind was already working through the implications, calculating distances and marching times, weighing risks and possibilities. The decision he made that night would echo through history. He would leave a skeleton force to watch the southern coast and march north with the core of his army. Not the slow, ponderous movement of a medieval host, but a forced march that would push men and horses to the very limits of endurance. It was a gamble that could have destroyed his kingdom, but Harold understood something that his enemies did not. In war, speed could be worth more than numbers. The camp came alive with urgent activity. Trumpets sounded the assembly, their bronze voices cutting through the night air, calling men from their sleep and their duties. By torchlight, the royal household began to pack. Not the leisurely breaking of camp that usually preceded a move, but the swift, economical movements of professionals preparing for war. You don't need to remember the exact route they would follow. Up the old Roman road called Waddling Street, through London, then north on Ermine Street toward York. What matters is the pace. Nearly 200 miles to be covered in less than a week, an almost impossible feat for a medieval army laden with weapons, supplies, and the 1,000 necessities of war. The king's personal guard, the Huscarls, were the first to be ready. These were professional warriors, men who had sworn their lives to Harold's service, and they moved with the swift efficiency of long practice. Their mail shirts caught the torchlight as they checked their weapons one final time, the steel links rippling like scales on some great serpent. Behind them came the FYRD, the citizen soldiers called from their farms and workshops to defend the realm. These men had already spent weeks in camp, watching the empty sea, and now they faced a march that would test every muscle in their bodies. Yet you could see in their faces, lit by the flickering flames of the torches, not despair but determination. This was their king, their land, their families that Harold Hardrada threatened. As dawn broke over the channel, the English army began to move. First came the mounted scouts, sent ahead to secure the road and ensure that fresh horses would be waiting at the royal manors along the route. Then came Harold himself, riding his great warhorse, his golden dragon banner streaming in the morning breeze. Behind him stretched a column of marching men that seemed to go on forever. Thousands of warriors moving with the steady rhythm of the truly determined. The pace was punishing from the very beginning. Where a normal army might cover 12 or 15 miles in a day, Harold drove his men to achieve twice that distance. The sound of their passage echoed across the countryside. The tramp of feet on Roman stone, the jingle of mail and weapons, the creak of leather and the rhythmic breathing of men pushed to their limits. Through the rolling hills of Kent they marched, past orchards heavy with autumn apples, through villages where wide-eyed children peered from doorways at the great column of warriors. The dust raised by thousands of feet hung in the air like a brown cloud, and the sound of their passage could be heard miles away, a deep, rhythmic thunder that spoke of urgent purpose. At the great bridge over the Thames, they paused only long enough to water the horses and allow the men to drink deeply from the river. Harold himself dismounted and walked among his warriors, offering words of encouragement, sharing a joke with a veteran sergeant, helping a young soldier adjust the straps of his pack. Leadership, he understood, was not just about giving orders. It was about being seen, being present when men needed to know that their sacrifice was recognized. London, when they reached it, was in a state of barely controlled panic. News of the disaster at Fulford Gate had preceded them, and the streets buzzed with rumors and fear. Some said the Vikings were already marching on the capital, others that William had landed and was burning his way across Kent. But the sight of the royal banner, the sound of Harold's trumpets, steadied the city's nerves. The king was here, the realm was not defenseless, and all might yet be well. They paused in London just long enough to gather supplies and reinforcements. From the royal armories came additional weapons and mail shirts for men whose equipment had suffered from the hard march. From the guilds and wards came fresh volunteers, craftsmen and merchants who took up spear and shield to march alongside the farmers and professional soldiers who formed the army's core. But even in London, Harold allowed no rest. The column formed up again within hours of its arrival, and once more the great march continued. North they went, along the arrow-straight line of Ermine Street, that marvel of Roman engineering that ran like a spear thrust toward the heart of England. The weather held fair for the first days, but as they pushed deeper into the Midlands, autumn began to assert itself. Morning mist clung to the valleys, and the nights grew sharp with the promise of frost. The men wrapped their cloaks tighter around their shoulders and bent their heads against the wind, but still they marched. Through Hertfordshire and Cambridgeshire, across the flat fenlands where the road ran straight as a die across mile after mile of marsh and meadow. Here, the wind had an edge like a knife, cutting through wool and leather to chill the bone. But still they marched, their breath steaming in the cold air, their feet keeping the remorseless rhythm that ate up the miles. At Huntingdon, they crossed the great Ouse on a bridge that had carried Roman legions to war against the Picts and Scots. At Stamford, they splashed through the Welland, the icy water shocking men fully awake as it soaked through their boots. Every mile brought them closer to their goal, but every mile also took its toll on men who had already been pushed beyond normal endurance. Some began to fall out, older men whose hearts could not sustain the pace, younger men whose feet had been rubbed raw by ill-fitting boots, pack animals that stumbled and could not rise again. But the core of the army, the veterans and the truly determined, pressed on with a resolve that bordered on the superhuman. Harold himself seemed tireless, riding up and down the column, encouraging the stragglers, consulting with his officers, maintaining the pace that would bring them to their destination in time. His horse was changed 3 times during the march, but the king himself never seemed to falter. When men looked at him, they saw not exhaustion but determination personified. By the 4th day, they were in Lincolnshire, passing through countryside that grew steadily more familiar to the northerners in the army. These were lands that some of them called home, villages where they had friends and family. The knowledge that Harold Hardrada's army was somewhere ahead, plundering and burning, added fresh urgency to already tired legs. As the sun set on the 5th day, scouts brought word that lifted every heart in the column. They were within a day's march of York. More importantly, their spies reported that the Viking army was encamped several miles east of the city, at a place called Stamford Bridge, apparently resting after their victory and waiting for the final submission of the northern earls. Harold Hardrada, it seemed, had made the classic mistake of the overconfident conqueror. He had allowed his army to disperse, sending parties throughout the countryside to gather supplies and hostages. His men were scattered, many without their armor, enjoying what they believed to be a well-earned rest after their triumph. That night, as the English army made its final camp before battle, Harold called his officers to a council of war. In the flickering light of torches planted in the ground, these battle-scarred veterans listened as their king outlined his plan. They would march before dawn, covering the final miles in darkness, and fall upon the Vikings at first light. Mile after grueling mile they marched, dust and sweat and the rhythmic tramp of thousands of feet. They did not know it, but they were marching towards a great and terrible victory. The Norwegian army was relaxing by the river, their armor laid aside in the autumn sun. They felt safe. They were wrong. Let us drift now to a gentle bend in the River Derwent, where the water runs clear and shallow over smooth stones, and an ancient wooden bridge carries the old Roman road across to the farther bank. This is Stamford Bridge, a place whose name will echo through the centuries, though on this warm September morning it seems the most peaceful spot in all of England. The air is soft with the golden light of early autumn, and you can almost hear the quiet murmur of the river as it flows beneath the bridge's wooden planks. Willows trail their branches in the water, and somewhere in the reeds a moorhen calls to its mate. It is September 25th, 1066, and the world is about to change forever. On the eastern bank of the river, the great Viking army has made its camp. After their crushing victory at Fulford Gate, Harold Hardrada's warriors have settled into the comfortable routine of conquerors. Many have laid aside their heavy mail shirts and war gear, content to bask in the unseasonably warm sunshine. Some are bathing in the river, their pale northern skin gleaming wet in the morning light. Others are mending equipment, sharpening weapons, or simply resting after the exertions of the past weeks. The mood in the camp is one of quiet satisfaction. They have won a great victory, taken the submission of York, and established themselves as masters of northern England. King Harold, they believe, is still watching the southern coasts for William's invasion, hundreds of miles away and completely unaware of their presence. There is talk of further conquests, of marching south to claim the rest of the kingdom. But for now, there is time to rest and enjoy their triumph. Harold Hardrada himself can be found near the center of the camp, his great frame stretched out on a pile of furs, discussing terms with the English hostages who have been brought from York. The negotiations are proceeding smoothly. The city has agreed to provide supplies and men for the Norwegian army, and in return, Harold has promised to spare it from the usual fate of conquered cities. You can picture the scene: the tall king lounging like some great cat in the sunshine, his frost-colored beard catching the light, his pale eyes surveying the pleasant valley where his army rests. Around him, his jarls and captains speak in low voices of the wealth of England, of the lands they will claim when Harold Godwinson is defeated. The sound of their voices mingles with the splash of men washing in the river and the distant lowing of cattle that the Vikings have commandeered for their evening meal. But Harold Hardrada was not just a warrior. He was also a careful strategist, and he had not grown careless in victory. Scouts had been posted on the surrounding hills, and sentries watched the roads that led to the bridge. It was one of these lookouts who first spotted the dust cloud rising in the west, still miles away but growing larger with each passing hour. At first, there was little concern. Dust clouds were common enough. They might be raised by a merchant caravan, a group of pilgrims, or perhaps a party of English nobles coming to make their submission to the new master of the north. But as the morning wore on, the cloud grew larger and more ominous, and the scouts began to report disturbing details. This was not a peaceful procession but an army, a large army, moving with purpose and speed directly towards Stamford Bridge. At the head of the column flew banners that made the blood run cold in Viking veins. The Golden Dragon of Wessex, the personal standard of King Harold Godwinson. The impossible had happened. Somehow, Harold had learned of the disaster at Fulford Gate and had covered nearly 200 miles in less than a week to bring vengeance to the army that had dared to invade his kingdom. The King of England was here, with his household guard and the flower of his army, and he was coming fast. The Norwegian camp erupted into controlled chaos as Harold Hardrada's war horns sounded the alarm. Warriors who had been lounging in the sun moments before now scrambled for their weapons and armor, their voices raised in sharp commands and urgent questions. The great king himself rose from his furs like a giant awakening, his battle-scarred hands already reaching for his sword. But there was a problem, a serious problem that would shape everything that followed. Many of the Viking warriors had left their heavy mail shirts and helmets back at their ships, anchored at Rickcall some miles away. In the warm sunshine and the confidence of victory, they had seen no need to bear the weight of full war gear. Now, faced with an immediate battle, they would have to fight in nothing more than leather jerkins and woolen tunics. Harold made a swift decision that spoke to both his courage and his understanding of the tactical situation. Rather than try to retreat to the ships, a movement that would expose his army to attack while strung out along the road, he would make his stand here at the bridge. The narrow crossing would force Harold's army to come at them in a column, negating their advantage in numbers and allowing the Vikings to fight on more equal terms. The deployment was swift and professional. The Norwegian army formed up on the eastern bank of the river, using the bridge as a natural choke point. Harold placed his best warriors, the men who had fought with him from the Arctic Ocean to the Mediterranean, in the front ranks, while the less experienced fighters and the recently recruited English allies took position behind them. You can almost hear the scrape of iron on stone as weapons were drawn, the rustle of leather as men adjusted their gear, the nervous snorting of the few horses that remained in the camp. Across the river, the dust cloud was resolving itself into individual figures. The glint of mail shirts, the flutter of banners, the rhythmic movement of an army in battle formation. King Harold's forces arrived at the western bank of the Derwent like a storm breaking over the peaceful valley. The sight that greeted them must have been sobering. 1,000 Viking warriors drawn up in battle array, their weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun, their voices raised in the ancient war songs that had struck terror into the hearts of their enemies for generations. At the front of the English army, Harold Godwinson sat his warhorse and studied the disposition of his enemies. He had achieved the impossible, complete strategic surprise against one of the most experienced military commanders in Europe. But the tactical situation was far from ideal. The bridge formed a natural bottleneck that would force his men to attack in small groups, allowing the Vikings to concentrate their defense against each assault. What happened next has become one of the most famous episodes in English military history. A single Viking warrior, a giant of a man wielding a massive two-handed axe, took position at the center of the bridge and defied the entire English army to pass. For perhaps an hour, he held that narrow wooden span against all comers, his great axe rising and falling like the hammer of Thor himself. One by one, English warriors approached the bridge, and one by one they fell back, wounded or dead. The lone Viking seemed tireless, invincible, a figure from the old legends come to life. His axe blade, already dark with blood, swept in great arcs that no shield could fully turn, no armor completely stop. The sound of his challenge echoed across the water, a wordless roar of defiance that spoke of the old gods and the ancient ways. But courage alone, however magnificent, cannot hold back an army forever. An English soldier, his name lost to history, though his deed lives on, found a broken boat beneath the bridge and floated silently downstream until he was directly below the Viking champion. From there, with a long spear thrust upward through the gaps in the wooden planks, he brought down the hero who had held the bridge. With the death of their champion, the way was open. The English army poured across the narrow span like water through a broken dam, their war cries echoing off the surrounding hills. The careful formations of both armies dissolved into the swirling chaos of hand-to-hand combat, and the meadows beside the Derwent became a battlefield that would be remembered for centuries. The fighting was fierce and desperate, with the outcome hanging in the balance for what seemed like hours. The Vikings, despite their lack of armor, fought with the fury of men who knew that defeat meant death or slavery. Harold Hardrada himself was everywhere, his great sword carving a path through the English ranks, his voice raised above the din of battle as he called on his men to stand firm. But slowly, inevitably, the superior numbers and equipment of the English began to tell. The Viking line, stretched thin by casualties and exhaustion, began to bend and crack under the relentless pressure. When Harold Hardrada himself fell, struck down by an English arrow that found the gap between his helmet and his mail shirt, the heart went out of the Norwegian resistance. The great king died as he had lived, with a weapon in his hand and defiance on his lips. Around his body, his household warriors made their last stand, selling their lives dearly in the ancient tradition of their people. But with their leader dead and their cause lost, even these heroes could not hold back the tide of English victory. As the sun began to set over the quiet river, the battle was over. The meadows were littered with the dead and dying, their blood mixing with the peaceful waters of the Derwent. Of the great army that had sailed from Norway with such high hopes, barely a tenth would live to see their homeland again. Tostig Godwinson, the exiled earl who had brought this catastrophe upon his own people, lay dead beside his Viking ally. The brother who had once been Harold's closest companion had chosen ambition over loyalty, and had paid the ultimate price for his treachery. As the sun set over the quiet river, the shield wall finally broke. The battle was over. The king was dead, and a new age had begun. For weeks, the Norman fleet had waited, their sails limp, their soldiers restless. William could only stare at the gray sea and pray for a change. And then one evening it came. The wind had been William's enemy for so long. Day after day, week after week, it had blown steadily from the north, pinning his great fleet to the Norman shore like a bird with clipped wings. The Duke of Normandy had assembled perhaps the greatest invasion force ever seen in these waters. Over 700 ships, some say 1,000, carrying knights and archers, horses and supplies, mercenaries from across Europe drawn by the promise of English gold and English land. But all of this meant nothing if the wind would not cooperate. The vessels lay anchored in the mouth of the River Dives, then later at St. Valery-sur-Somme, their painted hulls creaking gently in the harbor swells. The horses, noble destriers trained for war, grew restless in their makeshift stalls aboard the transport ships. The knights, proud men accustomed to action, found themselves reduced to waiting, watching, and wondering if God himself opposed their cause. William walked the docks each morning, his boots echoing on the wet wooden planks. The smell of salt and tar filled the air, mixed with the earthier sense of horse dung and leather, the sharp tang of metal being sharpened and oiled. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries seeming to mock the stranded fleet below. The Duke's face remained calm, but those who knew him well could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his hand rested always near his sword hilt. The waiting was hardest on the common soldiers. These were men who had left their homes, their harvests, their families, all for the promise of conquest. Now they sat idle, consuming precious supplies, growing fat and soft when they should have been growing rich on English plunder. Some whispered that perhaps this was a sign that God did not favor their cause. Others muttered darker things, that the delay was allowing Harold Godwinson to strengthen his defenses, to call up more troops, to prepare for their arrival. But William was not a man to be turned from his purpose by whispers or wind. He had staked everything on this venture. He had sold church lands to fund it, had called in every favor, had promised his followers wealth beyond their dreams. There could be no turning back now, no matter how long the wind kept them prisoners in their own harbors. The Norman chroniclers would later write that William spent these weeks in prayer, attending Mass each morning in the little church of St. Valery. The relics of the saint were brought out, paraded before the assembled army, blessed and venerated. Surely, the Duke reasoned, the saint would intercede for them. Surely the wind would change. And then, on the evening of September 27th, as the sun was setting over the gray waters of the Channel, something shifted. The banners that had hung limp for so long began to stir. The weathered faces of the sailors, men who could read the sky like a book, turned toward the horizon with sudden interest. The wind was changing. It started as barely a whisper, a gentle touch from the south that ruffled the surface of the harbor. But as the night deepened, it grew stronger, more confident. The masts began to creak as the vessels strained against their anchor lines. The sails, which had been furled for weeks, suddenly seemed to shimmer with possibility. Word spread through the fleet like wildfire. Men who had been dozing in their cramped quarters came spilling up onto the decks. The horses, sensing the change in their human companions, began to whinny and stamp. The smell of the sea seemed different now. Not the stale, enclosed scent of a harbor, but the fresh, open smell of distant shores. William himself stood at the prow of his flagship, the Mora, a gift from his wife Matilda. The vessel was magnificent, her hull painted in bright colors, her prow carved with the head of a fierce dragon. At her masthead flew the papal banner, the blessing of Pope Alexander II himself, who had declared William's cause just and holy. The Duke's dark hair whipped around his face as he felt the wind strengthen, and for the first time in weeks, his lips curved in a smile. The orders came swift and sure. Signal fires were lit along the coast to alert the scattered elements of the fleet. Horns sounded across the water, their deep notes carrying the message that every man had been waiting to hear. They would sail with the dawn. But dawn was still hours away, and those hours passed with the kind of organized chaos that only a military expedition can produce. Horses were led up narrow ramps from the shore to the transport ships, their hooves clattering on the wooden planks, their eyes rolling white with fear at the unfamiliar motion of the vessels. Knights checked and double-checked their equipment. Mail shirts were examined for broken links, sword edges were tested, helmets were polished to a dull gleam. The archers, those deadly crossbowmen and longbowmen who would prove so crucial in the battles to come, prepared their weapons with quiet efficiency. Crossbow strings were waxed and tested. Arrows were counted and recounted. The great wooden shields that would protect the bowmen were loaded carefully into the holds. And through it all, the wind continued to blow, steady and strong from the south. The waves that had lapped gently at the harbor walls for weeks now rolled in with purpose, as if the very sea itself was eager to carry this great armada to its destiny. As the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, the Norman fleet began to move. One by one, the great vessels weighed anchor, their crews hauling on the heavy ropes with songs and chanties that had been sung by Norman sailors for generations. The Mora led the way, her painted hull cutting through the gray waters as hundreds of ships fell in behind her. The sight must have been breathtaking to any who witnessed it from the shore. The morning mist clung to the water, giving the whole scene a dreamlike quality, as if the ships were sailing not on the sea, but through the clouds themselves. The painted hulls gleamed wetly in the dim light, and the forest of masts and rigging created a pattern as complex as any cathedral's stonework. Under the light of the moon, a forest of masts and sails moved silently across the water, carrying a new destiny to England's shores. The crossing would take most of the day, but the wind held steady, pushing them ever closer to the English coast. Behind them, the shores of Normandy grew smaller and smaller until they were just a dark line on the horizon. Ahead lay England and a crown, and a battle that would change the world. The great gamble had begun. The Norman ships found land in a wide, quiet bay. The coast was empty. The English army was hundreds of miles away. William's landing was silent, unopposed, and deeply ominous. The first light of dawn on September 28, 1066, revealed the English coast emerging from the morning mist like a sleeping giant. The cliffs of Sussex rose pale and chalky from the dark water, crowned with patches of green grass that swayed gently in the sea breeze. Below, sheltered between headlands, lay Pevensey Bay, a wide, natural harbor that had welcomed ships for centuries, though never ships quite like these. The Norman fleet approached in perfect formation. 700 vessels spread across the gray waters like a floating city. The Mora, William's flagship, led the way, her dragon-headed prow cutting through the gentle swells. Behind her came the great transport ships, their holds heavy with horses and men, followed by the smaller craft carrying supplies and equipment. The sea was calm, almost mirror-like, reflecting the forest of masts and the pale morning sky. As the ships drew closer to shore, a strange quiet settled over the fleet. The usual sounds of a military expedition, the clatter of armor, the snorting of horses, the rough jokes of soldiers, all faded to whispers. Every eye was fixed on the shoreline, searching for signs of resistance, for the glint of spear points or the movement of enemy troops. But the beach remained empty, peaceful, almost welcoming in its silence. The first boats to reach the shallows were the scouts, lean vessels that could navigate the tidal flats and muddy creeks that bordered the bay. Their crews leaped into the knee-deep water, hauling their craft up onto the pebbly beach with barely a sound. They moved with the practiced stealth of men who knew their lives might depend on silence, spreading out along the shoreline to secure the landing site. But their caution proved unnecessary. The beach was deserted. No English horns sounded the alarm. No shower of arrows greeted the invaders. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against the hulls of the approaching ships and the cry of seabirds disturbed from their morning fishing. William himself was among the first to set foot on English soil, though the moment nearly became a disaster. As he stepped from his boat onto the wet sand, his foot slipped, and he fell forward onto his hands and knees. For a moment, the watching Normans held their breath. Surely this was an omen, a sign that their cause was cursed. But the Duke, ever quick-thinking, grasped a handful of English earth in his fists and held it high. "See," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the water to the approaching ships. "I have taken England in my hands." The watching soldiers cheered, their relief turning the potential disaster into a moment of triumph. Even in this, their first moment on English soil, William showed the political instincts that would serve him so well in the months to come. Now began the complex and delicate process of landing an entire army. The great transport ships could not beach themselves directly. They drew too much water, and their precious cargo of warhorses was too valuable to risk. Instead, they anchored in the deeper water of the bay, while smaller boats ferried men and supplies to shore. The horses were a particular challenge. These magnificent destriers, trained for battle and worth a fortune each, had to be coaxed down specially built ramps into the shallow water, then led to shore by their handlers. The sight of these great war horses splashing through the surf must have been magnificent. Their coats gleamed wetly in the morning light, their breath steamed in the cool air, and their iron-shod hooves struck sparks from the pebbles as they were led up the beach. These were not ordinary horses, but the cream of Norman breeding, tall, powerful animals bred for one purpose: to carry armored knights into battle at full gallop. Behind the cavalry came the infantry, rank upon rank of Norman foot soldiers. These were professional warriors, many of them veterans of William's campaigns in Brittany and Maine. They wore mail shirts that reached to their knees, conical helmets with nose guards, and carried the distinctive kite-shaped shields that would soon become a terror to English defenders. Their weapons were simple but deadly: long swords, battle axes, and the feared Norman spear. The crossbowmen came ashore with particular care for their equipment. These men were specialists, highly valued for their skill with the complex mechanical crossbows that could punch through mail at considerable distances. Their weapons were carefully wrapped in oiled leather to protect them from the salt spray, and their precious bolts were counted and secured in waterproof cases. As the morning progressed, the quiet beach transformed into a bustling military camp. Tents began to appear in neat rows along the higher ground above the high tide mark. Cooking fires were lit, sending thin columns of smoke into the still air. The horses were picketed in temporary corrals, their handlers busy with the endless tasks of grooming and feeding. The sound of hammering rang out as the army's smiths set up their portable forges to repair equipment damaged during the crossing. But William was not content merely to establish a beachhead. Even as his army was still coming ashore, he was thinking ahead to the campaign that lay before him. Pevensey Bay was an excellent landing site, but it was also dangerously exposed. The Normans were now deep in enemy territory, far from home and surrounded by a hostile population. They needed to secure their position quickly and decisively. The first priority was intelligence. Where was King Harold? How large was the English army? How quickly could they respond to news of the invasion? Norman scouts, many of them recruited from among the Fleming mercenaries who knew the English coast, slipped away from the beachhead to gather information from the local population. What they learned was both encouraging and alarming. King Harold was indeed far away, somewhere in the north dealing with the Norwegian invasion. The local English forces were scattered and leaderless. But the very success of Harold's northern campaign meant that when he did turn south, he would be bringing with him an army flushed with victory and led by a king who had already proven his military skill. The second priority was fortification. William had not come this far to be driven back into the sea by the first English counterattack. His men began the backbreaking work of building field fortifications. Earthen ramparts topped with wooden palisades, ditches to break up cavalry charges, and watchtowers to give early warning of approaching enemies. The local population watched these developments with a mixture of fear and fascination. The villages around Pevensey Bay had never seen anything like this great army that had appeared overnight on their shores. Some of the braver villagers crept close enough to get a good look at the foreign soldiers, with their strange accents and unfamiliar equipment. Others simply fled, taking their families and whatever possessions they could carry to seek safety in the deep forests of the Sussex Weald. For the Normans themselves, the landing had gone almost too smoothly. Veterans of many campaigns knew that an unopposed landing often meant that the real fighting was yet to come. The enemy was simply choosing his ground, waiting for the right moment to strike. And indeed, as the sun reached its zenith on that first day in England, word was already racing northward along the old Roman roads. King Harold would know of the invasion within days, perhaps hours. As evening approached, the Norman camp settled into its first night on English soil. Sentries were posted along the perimeter, their eyes straining into the gathering darkness for any sign of movement. The horses were brought within the defensive lines, too valuable to risk to English raiders. Cooking fires were banked low to avoid creating obvious targets for enemy archers. William himself made the rounds of his camp, showing himself to his men, sharing a word here and there with the common soldiers, discussing plans with his captains. He was a skilled leader who understood that an army's morale was as important as its weapons. His presence was reassuring, calm, confident, utterly certain of eventual victory. But even William must have felt some unease as he looked out from the Pevensey ramparts at the dark English countryside beyond. Somewhere out there, perhaps already marching south, was King Harold Godwinson and the English army. The man who had just crushed the greatest Viking invasion in a generation. The man who now stood between William and the crown he claimed as his right. The Duke had made his move. He was now on English soil, and he would not leave until he wore a crown or lay in a grave. The die was cast, the Rubicon crossed. There could be no retreat now, no second thoughts. Victory or death, these were the only choices that remained. In the great hall at York, surrounded by his victorious but battered soldiers, King Harold heard the news. It must have felt like a cruel joke of fate. The march was not over. It was beginning again. The messenger arrived on a lathered horse, its flanks heaving and foam flecking its muzzle. The animal had been ridden hard along the old Roman roads, pushed to its limits by the urgency of the news it carried. The rider himself was dust-covered and exhausted, swaying in his saddle as he was led into the great hall where King Harold was holding court with his victorious captains. Just 3 days had passed since the triumph at Stamford Bridge. 3 days since the end of the Viking Age in England. The great hall still echoed with the sounds of celebration, the laughter of warriors recounting their deeds, the clink of ale cups raised in toast to fallen comrades, the gentle scraping of whetstones on notched blades as weapons were tended and repaired. Harold himself sat in the carved wooden chair that served as York's throne, still wearing the simple mail shirt he had fought in. There had been no time yet for ceremony, no opportunity to don the royal regalia that marked him as king. The crown of England seemed very far away in this northern stronghold, surrounded by the debris of battle and the satisfied weariness of hard-won victory. The messenger knelt before his king, his mud-stained cloak spreading around him like a dark pool. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse from shouting over the wind during his desperate ride. The words he carried would transform celebration into grim determination, victory into the prelude to an even greater trial. "My lord," the messenger gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "The Duke of Normandy, William has landed. At Pevensey. 3 days past. A great fleet, hundreds of ships, thousands of men." The hall fell silent. The laughter died away as if snuffed out by a cold wind. Every eye turned to the king, watching for his reaction, waiting to see how he would bear this crushing blow. For crushing it was. To learn of a second invasion, just as the first had been defeated, to face a fresh enemy when his own forces were depleted and exhausted. Harold's face remained impassive, but those who knew him well could see the momentary flicker of something. Not fear, for Harold Godwinson was not a man who knew fear, but perhaps the weight of understanding. The full magnitude of what lay before him. The cruel mathematics of war that demanded he ask everything of his men once again. The king rose slowly from his chair, his mail shirt rustling softly in the silence. When he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, carrying the authority that had made him the most powerful earl in England long before he wore the crown. "How many ships?" he asked. 700, my lord. Perhaps more. The whole bay was full of them. And William himself? Landed with the first boats, my lord. They've fortified the beach, built a camp. They're not raiders, they mean to stay. Harold nodded, his mind already working through the implications. William had chosen his moment well. With the English army committed in the north, the south lay virtually undefended. London itself was barely 2 days' march from Pevensey. If the Norman Duke moved quickly, he could be at the gates of the capital before Harold could return to stop him. But William was not moving quickly. The reports suggested he was fortifying his position, waiting. And suddenly Harold understood the enemy's strategy. William wanted Harold to come to him. Wanted to fight the English king when and where it suited Norman purposes. It was clever, calculating, and deeply dangerous. "Summon my captains," Harold commanded. "All of them. And send word to the southern shires. Every man who can carry a spear is to gather at London. The FYRD is called out in full levy." The next hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. The Great Hall of York became a war council, filled with maps spread across trestle tables, with the quiet voices of experienced commanders weighing options and calculating distances. The mathematics were daunting. York to London was nearly 200 miles by the old Roman roads. 200 miles that would have to be covered at forced march pace, with an army already tired from one campaign. But there was no choice. Every day they delayed was a day that allowed William to strengthen his position, to ravage the southern shires, to move closer to London and the heart of the kingdom. The English army would have to march, and march immediately, regardless of their exhaustion. The preparations began before dawn. In the pale gray light of early morning, the English camp stirred to life with the organized chaos of an army preparing to move. Tents were struck and rolled, weapons were bundled and secured. The wounded were loaded onto wagons for the long journey south. Those too badly hurt to travel were left behind in the care of the local monasteries, their part in the great drama of 1066 finished. Harold's own preparations were swift but thorough. His personal equipment was checked by his body servants. Mail shirt examined for broken rings, sword edge tested, helm polished and padded. His war horse, a great bay stallion that had carried him through the battle at Stamford Bridge, was saddled and bridled with special care. The king would need to set an example of endurance for his men, and his mount would be crucial to that example. The march began as the sun climbed above the eastern horizon, painting the Yorkshire countryside in shades of gold and amber. The army stretched out along the road in a long, serpentine column. First the royal household troops, Harold's own huscarls with their Danish axes and mail shirts that gleamed like silver scales in the morning light. Behind them came the levies from the northern shires, farmers and craftsmen who had answered their king's call, carrying spears and shields but wearing only leather jerkins for protection. The pace Harold set was punishing. This was not the leisurely progress of a royal progress, or the measured advance of an army moving toward a distant campaign. This was a race against time, against the Norman Duke who might even now be marching on London. The column moved at nearly 4 miles to the hour, a speed that would have been remarkable for fresh troops on a short march, but which became almost superhuman when sustained day after day by men already weary from battle. The landscape rolled past in an endless succession of hills and valleys, forests and fields. They followed the great Roman road called Ermine Street, that ancient highway built by the legions centuries before to link the northern frontiers with the capital. The road was straight and well-maintained, its stone surface allowing the army to move faster than would have been possible on the muddy tracks that served most of medieval England. But speed came at a cost. By the second day, men were beginning to fall out of the column, unable to keep up the relentless pace. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others limped away with feet bloodied by ill-fitting shoes or boots worn through by the constant marching. The army left a trail of stragglers behind it, good men who simply could not match the superhuman endurance demanded of them. Harold rode up and down the column constantly, showing himself to his men, offering words of encouragement to those who faltered, helping to maintain the pace through sheer force of personality. His presence was everywhere, at the front urging the advance guard forward, in the middle encouraging the foot soldiers, at the rear helping to bring up the baggage train. He seemed tireless, indestructible, a king worthy of the loyalty his men were showing him. The nights brought little rest. The army would halt just long enough to eat a hurried meal of bread and cheese, to tend to the most urgent needs of men and horses, to snatch a few hours of exhausted sleep on the hard ground beside the road. Then, before dawn, the horns would sound and the march would resume. Another day of grinding endurance in the race to save the kingdom. News reached them as they marched. Riders from the south brought reports of Norman movements, of villages burned and populations fleeing. William was not sitting idle in his fortified camp at Pevensey. He was sending out foraging parties, raiding expeditions that were both practical, gathering supplies for his army, and psychological, demonstrating to the English people that their king could not protect them. Each report was like a goad, spurring Harold and his men to even greater efforts. But the king was too experienced a commander to let anger cloud his judgment. William was trying to provoke him into hasty action, to force him into a battle on Norman terms. The English king would not be so easily manipulated. He would choose his own time and place for the confrontation that must surely come. On the 4th day, they passed through Lincoln, the old Roman city that controlled the crossing of the River Witham. The townspeople lined the streets to watch the army pass, some cheering, others simply staring in silence at these grim-faced warriors hurrying south to meet an uncertain fate. Children ran alongside the column for a while, excited by the spectacle of so many armed men, until their parents called them back to safety. The 5th day brought them to the edge of the great forest called Sherwood, that vast wilderness of oak and ash that stretched across the heart of England. Here the Roman road ran straight as an arrow through the green shadows, and the army's passage disturbed deer and wild boar that went crashing away through the underbrush. The forest was peaceful, timeless, unchanged since the days when the legions first marched this way. It seemed impossible that such tranquility could exist while the kingdom teetered on the brink of catastrophe. By the 6th day, the army was moving more like a force of nature than a collection of individual men. They had fallen into the rhythm of the march, the steady tramp of thousands of feet that ate up the miles with mechanical precision. Conversation had largely ceased. Men saved their breath for walking. Even the wounded marched on, supported by their comrades, determined not to let their king down in this, his greatest hour of need. As they approached the Thames Valley, the landscape began to change. The wild hills of the north gave way to the gentler, more cultivated countryside of southern England. Here were prosperous villages and well-tended fields, manor houses and churches that spoke of a land at peace. But even here, the signs of Norman raiding were beginning to appear. Smoke on the horizon, abandoned farmsteads, refugees trudging northward with their possessions piled on carts. South they marched, back down the long Roman roads. Each step was a testament to their loyalty, and each step brought them closer to the hill where England's fate would be decided. The great race was nearly over. Soon, very soon, Harold Godwinson and William of Normandy would stand face to face, and only one would walk away with a crown. As darkness fell on an October evening, two armies settled for the night on opposite hills. The air was cold and still, thick with the scent of wood smoke, horses, and the silent prayers of thousands of men. The place that would soon be known to history simply as Battle was, on this quiet October evening, nothing more than a low ridge crowned with apple trees. The fruit hung heavy on the branches, red and gold in the fading light, unharvested because the local farmers had fled south at the first news of the Norman landing. Now the sweet scent of ripening apples mingled with the sharper smells of an army preparing for war. King Harold's forces had arrived first, claiming the high ground with the instinct of experienced warriors. The ridge ran roughly east to west, its slopes gentle but steep enough to give advantage to defenders. At its highest point stood a gnarled oak tree, ancient even then, its spreading branches providing a natural landmark that would serve as the focal point for the English battle line. Here Harold ordered his standards planted, the golden dragon of Wessex and his own personal banner, the fighting man, embroidered by his wife's own hands. The English army spread across the ridge like a great crescent, their shields forming an unbroken wall along the crest. These were hard men, veterans of the Northern Campaign, their mail shirts still bearing the dents and scratches of Stamford Bridge. But they were also desperately tired. The forced march from York had taken its toll, leaving even the strongest warriors hollow-eyed with exhaustion. Many had not slept properly in a week, snatching only brief moments of rest beside the Roman roads during their headlong rush to the south. Yet there was a grim satisfaction in their ranks. They had chosen their ground well. The Norman Duke, for all his reputation as a master of war, would have to attack uphill against a disciplined shield wall. It had been done before, at Malden, at Ashington, and the memory of those old victories stirred in English hearts as the sun sank toward the western horizon. Below them, perhaps half a mile away across a shallow valley, the Norman army was making its own preparations. William had moved his forces up from Pevensey that very morning, bringing with him the full might of his invasion force. The Normans had chosen their camp with equal care, positioning themselves on a smaller rise that faced the English ridge. Between the two armies lay a marshy bottom land, crossed by a small stream that would complicate any charge. The Norman camp was a marvel of military organization. The tents were arranged in neat rows, each company knowing its place, each knight responsible for his section of the line. The great war horses were picketed in carefully guarded corrals, their valuable lives protected by rings of sentries. The sound of hammer on anvil rang out as the army's smiths worked by firelight, making last-minute repairs to weapons and armor. But it was the sight of the Norman cavalry that must have given the English pause. Even in the gathering dusk, the sheer number of mounted knights was impressive. These were the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, men who had trained from childhood for this moment. Their horses were magnificent animals, bred for war, trained to strike and wheel and charge again. Each knight represented a fortune in equipment. Mail shirt, sword, lance, shield, and helm, all crafted by master armorsmiths and paid for by the promise of English gold. William himself moved through his camp with the easy confidence of a commander who had never known defeat. He stopped to speak with his captains, sharing a joke with the Breton mercenaries, blessing the crossbowmen who would open tomorrow's battle. His presence was calming, reassuring, a reminder that this was not some desperate gamble, but a carefully planned campaign led by one of the finest military minds of the age. The Duke wore no crown yet, but he carried himself like a king already. His mail shirt was of the finest steel, his sword was a masterpiece of the swordsmith's art, and his manner radiated the kind of absolute authority that men follow into the very jaws of death. Tomorrow would bring the greatest test of his life, but tonight he seemed as untroubled as if he were planning a hunt in his Norman forests. As full darkness settled over the battlefield, both armies began the ancient rituals that precede great battles. Weapons were sharpened one final time, the whetstone's gentle rasp a familiar sound that somehow soothed nerves stretched taut with anticipation. Mail shirts were checked ring by ring for flaws that might prove fatal in the morning's fighting. Shields were examined, their leather covers removed to reveal the painted wood and iron beneath. The English warriors gathered around their fires in small groups, sharing what food they had, speaking in the low voices of men who know that morning might bring death. Some told stories of past battles, of victories won against impossible odds. Others spoke of home, of wives and children who seemed infinitely far away on this cold October night. A few sang the old songs, the battle lays that had been chanted by Saxon warriors for generations. Harold himself moved among his men like a shadow, offering words of encouragement, checking dispositions, ensuring that every man knew his place in tomorrow's battle line. The king had shed his royal robes for a simple mail shirt, indistinguishable from his warriors except for the golden circlet that marked his rank. He shared their food, their discomfort, their uncertainty about what the dawn would bring. "Remember," he told them, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "you fight for your homes, your families, your freedom. The Norman wants to make slaves of free Englishmen to parcel out our lands among his foreign knights. But we stand on English soil, and by God's grace we shall not be moved." Across the valley, in the Norman camp, different preparations were taking place. The knights knelt before their chaplains, receiving the sacrament and the blessing of the church. Pope Alexander himself had declared their cause just, had given William a sacred banner to carry into battle. This was not mere conquest, but a holy war, a crusade to bring proper order to a land that had strayed from Rome's authority. The crossbowmen cleaned and tested their weapons with the methodical care of professionals. These mechanical bows could punch through mail at 200 paces, but they were complex devices that required constant maintenance. Each man checked his supply of bolts, counting and recounting the iron-tipped shafts that might mean the difference between victory and defeat. In the Norman horse lines, grooms worked by torchlight to prepare the great destriers for battle. Each animal was worth more than most men would see in a lifetime, and their care reflected their value. They were fed the finest oats, their coats were brushed until they gleamed, their iron shoes were checked and rechecked. Tomorrow these magnificent beasts would carry their riders into the storm of battle, and their condition could determine the fate of kingdoms. The night air grew colder as the hours passed, and men on both sides drew their cloaks closer about their shoulders. The campfires burned lower, their light flickering across faces painted with shadow and doubt. Some men slept, exhaustion overcoming fear, their bodies finally claiming the rest they had been denied. Others lay wakeful, staring up at the stars and wondering what stories would be told of this night in years to come. In both camps, the priests were busy. English clergy moved among Harold's warriors, offering comfort and absolution, reminding them that death in defense of their homeland was a noble thing, pleasing to God. Norman chaplains did the same for William's men, blessing weapons and armor, sprinkling holy water on the banners that would lead them into battle. The horses sensed the tension in their human companions. They shifted restlessly in their picket lines, whinnying softly to each other, their ears pricked forward toward sounds that human senses could not detect. The war horses especially seemed to understand that tomorrow would bring the work they had been bred and trained for, the terrible dance of cavalry warfare that was their reason for existence. As midnight approached, both armies settled into the fitful rest that precedes great battles. Sentries were posted at regular intervals, their eyes straining into the darkness for any sign of enemy movement. But no attack came in the night. Both Harold and William were too experienced to risk a confused night battle when daylight would serve their purposes better. The last sounds to fade were the gentle murmur of prayers, the soft scrape of steel on stone as men gave their weapons one final edge, and the distant lowing of cattle that had wandered onto the battlefield from abandoned farms. The moon rose full and bright, casting everything in silver light, turning the two armies into something from a dream or legend. The campfires burned low. The moon watched from above. When the sun rose next, it would rise on a different England. The old world of Anglo-Saxon kings and Danish earls, of ancient freedoms and tribal loyalties, would die with the dawn. In its place would come something new and foreign, a Norman England ruled by Norman laws and Norman lords. But all of that lay in the future, hidden behind the veil of tomorrow's battle. For now, there was only the quiet night, the sleeping armies, and the apple trees heavy with unharvested fruit, their branches stirring gently in the cold October wind. The morning came, gray and cold. The English formed their line on the high ground, a great wall of shields and spears, silent and unmoving. Dawn broke slowly over the Sussex countryside on October 14th, 1066. The sky was overcast, heavy with clouds that promised rain before the day was done. A thin mist clung to the marshy ground between the two armies, softening the harsh lines of the battlefield and giving the whole scene a dreamlike quality, as if the coming battle were something happening in another world entirely. The English were the first to stir. Harold's men had been awake since before dawn, roused by the gentle sound of horns echoing across the ridge. There was no urgency in their movements, no sense of panic or haste. These were experienced warriors who knew the value of preparation, who understood that battles were won as much by careful planning as by courage in the moment of crisis. The great shield wall began to form as the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. It was a sight that would have been familiar to warriors from centuries past, a long line of overlapping shields, painted in bright colors and reinforced with iron studs. Behind each shield stood a man with a spear, his weapon held at the ready, its point gleaming in the pale light. The wall stretched across the entire width of the ridge, anchored at both ends by dense thickets that would prevent the Norman cavalry from outflanking the English position. At the center of the line stood King Harold himself, positioned beneath the ancient oak tree that crowned the ridge. His royal standards flew overhead, the golden dragon of Wessex and his personal banner, the fighting man. Around him stood his huscarls, his household warriors, men who had sworn to die rather than see their king fall. They carried the great Danish battle axes that had been their ancestors' weapon of choice, two-handed weapons capable of cleaving through mail and bone with equal ease. The king wore no crown today, just the simple iron helm of a warrior. His mail shirt was well-worn, battle-tested, comfortable as an old friend. In his hands he held a sword that had been in his family for generations, its blade marked with the smith's runes and polished bright by long use. Harold Godwinson looked every inch what he was, a warrior king who had earned his throne through skill and courage, not inheritance. Below them, across the valley, the Norman army was also stirring to life. Their camp was a marvel of military organization, each unit knowing its place, each man understanding his role in the day's work. The sound of horns and drums echoed across the battlefield as the various contingents formed up in their appointed positions. The Norman battle line was different from the English formation. Where Harold's men formed a single, solid wall, William's army was arranged in 3 distinct divisions. In the center stood the Norman heavy infantry, mail-clad veterans who would advance behind their shields to engage the English spear wall. On the flanks were the allied contingents, Bretons from the wild western peninsula, Flemings from the Low Countries, French knights who had come south seeking glory and gold. But it was the cavalry that made the Norman army truly formidable. Hundreds of mounted knights waited behind the infantry, their lances bright with pennons, their horses pawing the ground and snorting white breath into the cold air. These were the flower of Norman chivalry, men who had been trained from childhood in the art of mounted warfare, who saw themselves as the natural rulers of lesser men. William himself rode along the front of his battle line, magnificent in his mail and mounted on a great black destrier. He carried no banner yet. That honor would wait until the battle was won. But his presence was unmistakable, his voice carrying clearly as he addressed his men in the 3 languages of his polyglot army: French to the Normans, Flemish to the mercenaries, Latin to the priests who had come to bless this holy war. "Today," he called out, his words echoing across the field, "we fight not for gold or glory alone, but for the righteous cause that God has placed in our hands. The English have rejected the authority of Holy Church, have crowned a perjurer as their king. We come as instruments of divine justice, to set right what has been made wrong." The battle began not with a charge or a clash of arms, but with a sound like distant thunder, the rhythmic beating of thousands of spears against shields as the Norman infantry advanced up the slope. It was an ancient way of making war, this steady, deliberate approach that allowed men to work themselves up to the proper pitch of battle fury while maintaining the discipline that would keep them alive. Behind the advancing foot soldiers came the crossbowmen, their mechanical bows already loaded with iron-tipped bolts. These were professionals, men who made their living with these complex weapons, and they deployed with the smooth efficiency of long practice. At a command from their captain, they raised their bows in unison, the strings drawn back to the locking mechanisms that would release death at 200 paces. The first volleys hissed through the air like deadly rain, the bolts arcing high over the Norman infantry to fall among the English ranks. Most struck harmlessly against the great shields of the defenders, but some found their mark, and the first cries of wounded men echoed across the battlefield. The English replied with their own missiles, javelins and throwing axes that came spinning down the slope to crash into the Norman ranks. But these were just the opening moves of a much larger dance. The real battle began when the Norman infantry reached the base of the English position and began their assault on the shield wall. The sound was like thunder, like the crashing of great waves against a rocky shore. The impact of hundreds of men throwing themselves against an immovable barrier of wood and iron and human determination. The English line held. It had been built for this moment, designed to absorb and repel exactly this kind of attack. The great shields overlapped like fish scales, each man supporting his neighbor, the whole line moving like a single organism. When a Norman soldier managed to break through, he found himself surrounded by English spears, cut down before he could exploit his advantage. For hours the battle raged with the same pattern: Norman attack, English defense, the gradual wearing down of both sides as men fell to exhaustion as much as to enemy weapons. The ground at the base of the ridge grew muddy with blood and churned earth, littered with the debris of war, broken spears, dented helms, shields split by axe blows. Then came the moment that changed everything. Whether by accident or design, a section of the Norman line began to give way, falling back down the slope in what appeared to be a rout. Part of the English right wing, seeing their enemies in flight, broke from the shield wall to pursue them. It was exactly what William had been waiting for. The Norman retreat was a feint, a carefully orchestrated maneuver designed to draw the English from their strong position. As soon as the pursuing English were clear of the ridge, the Norman cavalry struck. The great war horses came thundering up the slope, their riders' lances leveled, their hooves striking sparks from the stones. The isolated English were caught in the open, away from the protection of the shield wall, and they paid the price in blood. But still the main English line held. Harold's husscarls stood firm around their king, their axes taking a terrible toll of any Norman who came within reach. The battle had become a grinding test of endurance, each side trying to break the others while through sheer persistence and courage. As the afternoon wore on, both armies began to show the strain. Men fell from exhaustion, their strength sapped by hours of fighting in heavy mail. The wounded crawled away from the battle line when they could, or simply collapsed where they stood when they could not. The sounds of combat grew quieter, more labored, as if the very air had grown too thick to breathe. It was then that fate dealt its final, decisive blow. An arrow, fired high into the air by a Norman archer, arced down through the gray sky to strike King Harold in the eye. Some say it was a lucky shot, a random missile that found its mark by chance. Others claim it was aimed deliberately, the work of a master bowman who had singled out the English king for death. However it happened, the result was the same. Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, fell beside the ancient oak where he had planted his standards. The fighting man banner toppled with him, its bright colors disappearing into the press of bodies around the royal position. For a moment, the English line wavered. The loss of their king was like a blow to the heart, a wound that seemed to drain the strength from every man. But the husscarls still stood, still fought, still died around their fallen lord. They had sworn oaths that meant more to them than life itself, and they would not break those oaths while breath remained in their bodies. The end came swiftly after that. With Harold dead and the royal standards fallen, the English will to resist finally cracked. The great shield wall that had held for so many hours began to break apart, men fleeing toward the woods at the rear of the position. Some fought on in small groups, but the battle was essentially over. William of Normandy rode to the crest of the ridge as the sun began to set, his destrier stepping carefully over the bodies of the fallen. The Duke dismounted beside the oak tree where Harold's body lay, removing his helm in a gesture of respect for a fallen enemy. Around him, his knights were already beginning the grim work of counting the dead and tending to the wounded. As the sun began to set, the shield wall finally broke. The battle was over. The king was dead, and a new age had begun. The field fell quiet except for the moans of the wounded and the distant sound of Norman horns celebrating victory. The apple trees still stood, their fruit unharvested, witnesses to the end of one world and the beginning of another. The field was quiet now, save for the wind. The Norman duke stood victorious, but his work was not done. A battle can win you land, but only a crown can make you a king. The morning after Hastings brought a strange stillness to the countryside. Where once the clash of steel had echoed across the hills, now only the gentle rustle of autumn leaves could be heard. William stood among his men, surveying the battlefield that had changed everything. The English king lay dead, his army scattered like seeds on the wind. But victory, William knew, was only the beginning of his true work. In the days that followed, the Norman army began its slow, methodical march toward London. This was not the hurried advance of conquerors drunk on victory, but the careful procession of a duke who understood that kingdoms are won not just with swords, but with patience and wisdom. Each town they approached, each manor they passed, became another thread in the tapestry William was weaving across England. The countryside seemed to hold its breath as the Norman column moved northward. Farmers paused in their harvest work to watch the foreign banners pass. Children peered from doorways, wide-eyed at the sight of these men from across the sea who had changed their world in a single afternoon. The very air seemed different now, charged with the quiet tension of a land in transition. William himself rode at the head of his army, but gone was the fierce warrior of Hastings. In his place sat a man already thinking like a king. He observed everything: the quality of the fields, the condition of the roads, the faces of the people who would soon be his subjects. Each village elder who came forward to offer submission was received with courtesy. Each messenger who brought word of distant lords was heard with careful attention. The march to London took many weeks, not because the distance was great, but because William understood that conquest must be thorough. Better to secure each mile properly than to rush forward and leave rebellion brewing behind. His army moved like a great, slow river, steady and inexorable, carrying with it the weight of Norman law and Norman order. Along the way, word spread ahead of them like ripples on a pond. In manor houses and monastery scriptoriums, men bent over parchments, writing letters that would reshape the political landscape of England. Some English lords chose to flee to Scotland or across the sea to Ireland. Others began the delicate negotiations that would allow them to keep their lands under Norman rule. The old order was dissolving, but slowly, like mist in the morning sun. Canterbury welcomed William with all the ceremony due to a conqueror who had shown mercy. The great cathedral bells rang out across the countryside, their bronze voices carrying news of submission and acceptance. Here, in this ancient seat of English Christianity, William began to understand the true weight of what he had undertaken. He was not merely conquering a kingdom, he was inheriting a civilization. As autumn deepened into winter, the walls of London finally came into view. The great city on the Thames, with its Roman foundations and Saxon additions, waited like a prize at the end of a long quest. But William was too wise to simply force his way through the gates. London would need to be won through negotiation, not siege. The English lords who remained had gathered in the city, uncertain of their fate, but knowing that resistance was futile. One by one, they emerged to meet with the Norman Duke. These were not the dramatic surrenders of romance tales, but quiet, practical conversations between men who understood that the world had changed, and they must change with it. Edgar Atheling, the young prince who might have been king in another world, came forward with all the dignity his youth allowed. His submission was perhaps the most poignant of all, for in it lay the death of the old English royal line. William received him with honor, recognizing in the boy's courage something worthy of respect, even in defeat. The bishops and abbots of England faced perhaps the most complex choice of all. Their loyalty was to God first, but they served earthly kings, and now their earthly king was dead. After much prayer and consultation, they chose to see in William's victory the hand of divine providence. If God had granted him victory, then perhaps God intended him to rule. Archbishop Ealdred of York, who had crowned Harold such a short time ago, now prepared to perform the same sacred duty for the Norman Duke. The irony was not lost on anyone, but in the medieval world, such ironies were often seen as evidence of God's mysterious plan unfolding. And so it was decided that William would be crowned on Christmas Day, in Westminster Abbey, where this entire story had begun with Edward the Confessor's death and Harold's hasty coronation. The wheel had come full circle, and England would have a new king. Christmas Day, 1066, dawned cold and clear over London. In Westminster Abbey, the great Norman and English lords gathered together for the first time not as enemies, but as subjects of a common crown. The ancient stones of the abbey had witnessed many coronations, but none quite like this one. William entered the abbey not in the simple robes of a Norman duke, but in the full regalia of English kingship. The crown that would be placed on his head was the same that had graced the brows of English kings for generations. In this moment, continuity was more important than conquest. The ceremony unfolded with all the ancient majesty that centuries of tradition could provide. Latin prayers echoed through the stone arches, while outside, the people of London waited to learn the final fate of their kingdom. When Archbishop Ealdred spoke the words that made William king, it was as if the very foundations of England shifted, settling into a new configuration that would endure for centuries. As the crown was placed upon William's head, something remarkable happened. The Norman soldiers outside the abbey, hearing the shouts of acclamation from within, mistook them for sounds of rebellion. In their eagerness to protect their new king, they began setting fire to nearby buildings. For a few chaotic moments, it seemed as if London itself might burn on the day of William's triumph. But order was quickly restored, and the fires extinguished. Perhaps it was fitting that even William's coronation was marked by the clash between Norman force and English tradition, for his reign would be spent balancing these two great influences. As the crown was placed upon William's head, the echoes of the tumultuous year finally began to settle. The story of 1066 was over, but the story of Norman England was just beginning. In that sacred moment, surrounded by the stone saints of Westminster Abbey, William the Conqueror became William the King, and England stepped across the threshold into a new age. The wind that had blown across the battlefield at Hastings now whispered through the streets of London, carrying with it the promise of change and the weight of destiny fulfilled. 3 kings had claimed England's throne in this single, extraordinary year. Now only one remained, and he would rule for decades to come, shaping the kingdom that would one day become an empire. And so, our long journey through the year 1066 comes to a gentle close. Tonight, we have traveled far and wide. We have felt the chill of the North Sea with the Vikings, watching their dragon-proud ships cut through the gray waters toward an uncertain fate. We have gazed up at the fearful comet in the night sky, that harbinger of change that set men's hearts racing with worry and wonder. We have stood on the windy hill at Hastings, where the fate of a kingdom hung in the balance with each clash of shield and sword. We have walked with kings and soldiers, felt their hopes and fears as if they were our own. We have shared the quiet terror of the farmer watching the horizon, wondering what tomorrow might bring to his simple world. We have witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, seen how a single day can change the course of centuries. We have felt the weight of crowns and the burden of choices that echo through time. As your mind continues to float through time, let these stories become soft, distant echoes. You don't need to hold on to them. They are just whispers from a world long past. Whispers that grow fainter now, like voices carried away on the evening breeze. A world of 3 kings, 2 invasions, and 1 kingdom's destiny, all decided in a single dangerous year. But that world is far away now, separated from us by nearly 1,000 years of seasons and storms, of births and deaths, of countless quiet moments just like this one. The battles have been fought. The crowns have been won and lost. The great wheel of history has turned, as it always does, carrying those ancient dramas away into the gentle mists of memory. But now, it is time to leave that world behind. It is time to let go of the past and sink into the deep, quiet peace of the present moment. Feel yourself settling, like autumn leaves finding their rest upon the forest floor. The story is over. Your journey for tonight is done. It is time now simply to rest. Sleep well.